Well, we'll get started here in a minute. I'm just trying to set up this cross-platform streaming, which I haven't done before, but seems helpful. So give me one sec. All right, well, let's get started. What's up? How's it going, everyone? Happy Sunday, April 14th. Is it just me, or is this year absolutely flying by? My birthday's at the end of the month, and it just doesn't feel like we're already in April. It's mind-blowing to me. But here we are. I try to stream on the weekends because it's just easier for me. And I wanted to do something Next.js related that was top of mind for myself. And I've just been thinking a lot about pages, layouts, and there's a lot between the most basic beginner cases and some of the more advanced features. I've been kind of collecting a small list of FAQs as people have asked questions that I don't know that I have all the answers, but I think we can walk through quite a bit of stuff and also have a chance to answer some questions from y'all in the chats as well too. So I'm sure there's going to be plenty to get into. Let's see if this works. I'm going to try split sharing here. What is up, everyone? Happy Sunday. I haven't streamed to YouTube in a while, so for the YouTube peeps, what is up? For a while there, I really like the setup with OBS. It makes it really easy to do streaming versus going natively to YouTube. I was using Restream for a while, but now this also gives me the ability to go not only Twitch, YouTube, but also on X as well. So we've got triple platform streaming here. We got some inception going on. But yeah, I'm excited to see how this goes, and I'll try to periodically pop back into the questions here and see if I can answer what's top of mind for y'all. So just to summarize, I guess, what I would like to cover today, I want to talk about the basics of pages and layouts in Next.js, but then I also want to progress through and get into some of the more advanced features that you may or may not have used and how they work, and maybe some of the constraints on why they work that way. Question around AirChat. I actually do have an AirChat account. I got it started, and it's kind of interesting. It's for those who haven't heard of it, it's like a voice-based social media. It seems pretty interesting. Should we treat layouts as completely static components? We'll get into dynamic and static and the behaviors of that with layouts and how that relates to data fetching as well too. Happy Sunday. All right. Cheers from Chile. Let's get into it. Yeah, if you want to shout out where you're tuning in from, that's always fun. It's always cool to hear people tuning in from all over. Let me jump into this Excalidraw that I have here. And I just want to share some of the things that were top of mind for myself. This is my rough curriculum for what I want to talk through. Some of the basics, of course, just in case you aren't familiar with how any of this stuff works yet. Nested layouts, fetching data in pages or layouts, using metadata. Can I use metadata in my head component? Do I have to use the metadata API? Where should I put authentication? Where should I use params and search params and accessing those values? Can I do it at the top? Do I need to do it down more nested? Should I cache things or nah? Can I have different HTML roots or multiple root layouts? And then we start to get into more of the advanced bits like route groups or opting out of routes, parallel and intercepted routes, which is actually what started this demo / idea. Maybe I'll start there because I think it's actually interesting. The genesis for the stream actually was some improvements we've made to the Vercel dashboard. There was a question, we posted this video showing how we improved the loading performance of the Vercel dashboard. And specifically, we were fetching data in this navbar component, and then we fetch data in the page content. But the question was, how do I access something that's in the URL, like /lerob up here, but then I also need to access it down here. And of course, there's, accessing the user information over here for the authentication state as well too. But what I started building out this demo where you can change between profiles and it changes the profile picture, profile name, and it's using parallel routes, one of the more advanced routing features. And I realized that to get to this point, it's worth stepping through the rest of the routing features before we just jump right into parallel routes. But that was the inspiration, I guess, for wanting to go a little bit deeper in some of these concepts, because I've done one other video walking through just pages and layouts specifically, but I know that there's a lot to cover and we've got time, so we might as well. Dallas, India, Sweden. What's up? From Mars. Oh, cool. Chilling on Mars, just watching some YouTube, watching some Twitch. I get it. I understand. What is up? Budapest? What's your take on fetching data with the use server attribute versus APIs versus directly on the page? Actually, that is a good question. We should put this in here, because I have seen that question come up quite a bit. Brazil, Indonesia, what's up? What did G. Rausch mean by no new APIs? Yes, no new APIs. I think if we have time, we can get into partial pre-rendering as well too. Morocco, what's up? Okay, I'm gonna hop. Oh, client-side data fetching as well too. I guess that is, it's not exactly related to pages and layouts, but they often go hand in hand, right? So I'll see if I can get to that as well. Okay, let's start with the most basic thing. So I'm gonna be talking through the app router. If you haven't heard of the app router yet, it was originally released in beta with Next.js 13. We're now on Next.js 14.2, and you can have a app folder with this app router in your Next.js application that lives alongside the pages router that was Next.js versions 1 to 13. So if you haven't used it yet, you can kind of incrementally bring this into your application. Even if you're still using a pages router application, you can have one route on pages router and you can have another route on app router. Let me pull up my local application here just to demonstrate that, like while we're here. Let's do pages. We'll do test.tsx and save this. I'm also using Super Maven. Shout out to their team for allowing me to try this out, and I'm interested to see how it does for code completion as well too. So right now, because I have a dynamic route in my app, it's going to pick up /test. So I'm going to need to do something else. Maybe not the best demo. Maybe I'll do like test. We'll do test foo. No? Test foo. It must still be getting swallowed by that dynamic route. Well, whatever. I could delete this. Actually, let me go ahead and save these. Update versions. Cool. I'm going to get rid of this. And let's go back to here. Get rid of this. And let's see, I probably need to restart. Okay. So now that I don't have that dynamic route in app that was swallowing test, just showing that this is a completely separate pages router world, which is denoted by underscore. Is it 3? I think it's 3 underscores. No, 2 underscores. Underscore next. But you can use both of these. Also, by the way, for those of you who are coming from the pages router world, one of the quirks of the pages router that has always been kind of annoying to me is that test and test index are the same thing. Like, this always bothered me, and it's nice that in the app router there's a specific file convention that denotes a routable piece of UI, so you don't ever have to worry about that conflict, which it seems minor, right? Like, oh, that would never happen. Well, in reality, that actually does happen with really large Next.js applications, so it's nice to have that be kind of a non-issue. Okay, let me go back, and what we're going to do is we're going to make our first route, just the most basic route, in the app router and walk through how it works. And I'm using this, maybe actually, I'll get rid of all of this so we can go even more basic. We'll keep all that. So we're going to make a new file, page.tsx. So rather than /test, where the name of the file was literally the route you were routing to, or index if it was in a folder, in the app router, just the most basic routable UI is something with the page file. Now, the typical question is like, does it have to be that? Can I change it? It has to be that. And there's actually some pretty good editor integrations that, in my opinion, have made having the same file name not as big of an issue. So personally, I haven't found it to be that problematic. I'm usually, command Ping my way through the different pages, and then you can also type in like app/ slug or something that you have, and then you just know, okay, I need to navigate to that specific page. This is a small app, so there's not a ton going on here. But the page in your app directory, this is your index route. So if I have some page, hello world here, in my layout, my root layout, all it's doing right now is just, and these are the only required parts of a root layout, is essentially scaffolding the initial shell of my application. And it's got an HTML tag and it's got a body tag, setting up a font, but really nothing else than that. So let me go here. What happens is that layouts in pages are composed together. And I was thinking maybe as we start to dive into the bits here, this might be too large. We'll see. Maybe it's better like this. I thought it might be helpful to try to show the way this is working, because the layout has some children, and that's the connection between these two components. like the root layout composes these children, and the children are the page in this instance. So this page is just saying hello world, but that's how these two components merge together essentially. So when I go back to here, let me get rid of this. Go back to our, oh, I have a redirect. I forgot about that too. I should have started with a basic app instead of this one. Oops. When I go back to my index route with no redirect, this is just the most basic page. It's a default exported function that returns some JSX, returns some UI. Now, by default, all of the pages and layouts in the app router are server components. And by default, they're all set up, and a lot of the APIs are also set up to enable streaming. Now, there's going to be constraints and trade-offs of that architecture that dictate how a lot of the APIs are built. And we're going to talk through some of the proper ways of utilizing those APIs that lean into that architecture, because it can feel frustrating if you're fighting against the APIs versus going down the path that they're hopefully trying to nudge you towards. Now, right away, I want to call out the most common question, the most common FAQ, which is, okay, you told me that everything, I'm going to get this back to normal because it's huge. You told me that everything was a server component. Does that mean that the goal is to make every single thing in my application server components? Are client components bad? And the answer to that is no. It's actually intended that you have both server and client components. It's about the harmony between the two that's what makes this model great and possible. And secondarily, client components, even though they're named client components, they're still pre-rendered. So they are using the client to be able to add interactivity to your application. So this content here, this H1, this hello world tag, it's still going to be pre-rendered. It would still get ran during a build if I'm not doing anything dynamic on the page. Those are probably the most like basic level questions that people have about this model. I'm going to pause. Let's pause. First time chatters, hello. Next.js has a cache tool. Is it wrong or unnecessary to use other tools? Yeah, we can talk a little bit about caching. Can you have more than one layout? Yes, you can have more than one layout. We're going to get into route groups and some of the more advanced routing features where it's okay to have multiple kind of layouts at the top level, or you can nest layouts further down in your application. I'm working on a pagination screen with lots of announcements and images that can be updated by the owner. And I had this doubt, what is the best or right way to do this? Yeah, we can talk about that. Can we use Storybook with Next.js? Yes, it's supported with the pages and app router as well too. Is it okay to use the app directory inside the source directory? Yes, that is supported and totally fine. That's basically just a code style, code convention thing. It's really up to whatever y'all want to do. Loading file, we can talk about data fetching. Yeah, intercepted parallel routes, we're going to get into that. Redirects, internationalization. 14.2, so 3 bood 09, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. 14.2 was just released last week, so check it out. Would be cool to go into revalidating already rendered server components. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Does Next.js support audio optimization? No, I don't. I don't know exactly what you're looking for by audio optimization, but we do not. Do I need a suspense boundary when importing a client component from a server component? You do not. We'll talk through passing through the different boundaries and what that composition looks like. Yeah, audio component does sound interesting though. And another request for internationalization. So love all of that. We will definitely get into that as well too. Let me go back to my list. We'll cross these off. I'll give this a little check. Where's my check? We'll give these a little check as we get through them. Okay, so by this point, and comment in the chat if I go over something too quickly or you want me to reiterate it, but hopefully we're on the same page about just how the basics of how you scaffold out a route and a layout. Now let's talk about nesting. Let's say I want to have, I've already got my index route at app/page, which we were denoted by here. But what about if I want to have another route in my application? Let's call it, I'm going to take this. We're going to call this about. So if I want this about route, I still denote the route with a page, but it still uses, this root layout is still above that page. So in the same way that you compose together the root layout and the child of the index route, it's the same with the about route as well too. So the way that maps over here is if I do about and I do page.tsx and I go in here and whoops, and let's call this, wow. Let's call this about. I'm just going to get rid of that. So to show the example here, index route, I'll make this bigger again. Index route, about route, just like that. So the folder structure is still representative of the actual URL structure. Now this also works if you need to do dynamic routes as well too, which maybe we want to, maybe when we talk about, oh no. When we talk about nesting, we want to talk about dynamic routes as well. So let's do that. Let's say that for /dashboard, so I'm building my dashboard application. Inside of here, I want to have a completely different layout that looks different from the rest of my application. Now, it's going to be reused across multiple pages. So let's say that maybe I'll take this and go like, we're going to draw an arrow from here and then an arrow to here. So in my dashboard, we want a React component that we want to reuse across multiple different pages. So if we hoist or if we lift that up to a layout, now all of a sudden we can reuse that across both pages. So maybe this is /settings, and maybe this is, I don't know, account or something. So I have different routes below my nested layout, and I want them both to be routable as well too. So let's go ahead and change to that. So I've got dashboard inside of here. The same mapping of this tree on the right I can do with my folder structure. So I've got /about, I've got /settings, and inside of here, let's do page.tsx. We'll call this account page. And in the settings page, make a new file, page.tsx. This is going to be settings page. And then we'll go back and we'll call this like the root dashboard page. And let's make this a little bit better. Let's do a section. Let's do this. And then let's do some links. Cool. And let me import next link. So we got a link to dashboard/account. We got a link to dashboard/settings. So we're importing the next link component. If you haven't seen next link, which if you're here, I'm guessing you probably have. But if you haven't, it's just an A tag under the hood, but it gives you prefetching if you would like as well too. You can, of course, turn that off. So /dashboard. Now in my dashboard page, I have my root dashboard page, but I also have two links. And for the sake of my well-being, we're going to add underline and let's do class name. Sometimes I like to just blindly accept whatever the autocomplete gives me to see if it's anything that's good. Let's see. That still not my favorite. What do we got here? There we go. Root dashboard page, account settings. So now I go to account. I navigate to /dashboard/account /settings. I navigate to dashboard/settings. So this doesn't yet have that root layout that I hoped for, right? I want to share something between all of these. And maybe that is, I think, well, we'll save the fancy diagrams or the fancy components for later. But inside of /dashboard, I want to make that layout.tsx file that's going to be used across this, and this page. So inside of here, I can do export default function dashboard layout. That takes in React Children. Okay, that looks fine to me. So now it's really not doing anything at this point. If I reload, there's nothing here. But what I want to do is instead do some kind of, I don't know, some kind of better layout for this nested layout. So my root layout, it's just the HTML and the body tag. We go into dashboard, we have this nested layout, and right now it's just passing through the children. So maybe inside of here we want that section, and let's also do, I don't know, like a nav or something. We could take these links. It's not a bad idea. And we'll just get rid of this section since we're going to lift it up and put this in the layout. Maybe inside of this nav, we've got these links in here. Let's import the links. Okay. So now in the layout, we've got the links inside of a nav. Then we render the children below. So this page would be the root dashboard page. Save that. This one, settings page. This one, account page. So let me start this back up. Cool. Let me reload this. The styling is like a little botched here, but I've got in my root layout, or in my nested layout, I have account. Oh, justify between. Autocomplete. I don't want it. Space X4. Text small. The text is so big, it's like messing with my brain when I'm zoomed in that far. But now, okay, we got these links in here, and then we've got the children, so root dashboard page. Now when I'm navigating between, this has been lifted up to my layout. Now, you might be wondering, what's the point of all of this? Why do I want to use these built-in concepts for layouts or pages if they're all React components? Shouldn't I just make this a navbar component and import it and use it in every single one of the pages? And this is where things get a little interesting, because you can build types of experiences that were previously kind of hard to do in the pages router, where you want to share some state across page transitions. So let's say that, I don't know, I'm going to give let's say, function counter, and we'll do function counter. So we're going to import, I'm going to get rid of that. So far, Super Maven, the code completion thing I'm using, it's fast but kind of chaotic. I think I got a counter. You clicked counter blank times. Let's say that in reality, this wouldn't be a counter in your nav bar. It would probably be, maybe some kind of animation or transition between the two, or a dark mode toggle or something like that. But for the sake of this demo, we're going to throw this in there. Let's see. So I'm glad we've improved these errors. That's nice. These errors are definitely better than they used to be. It tells me pretty clearly, hey, you just used this use state you need to make this a client component, which is absolutely right. And you might be wondering, is that okay? Am I allowed to do that? Should I be doing that? Am I going straight to jail? You're not going straight to jail. It's actually totally okay and allowed to use server and client components together, especially in this instance because we have a button that has some interactivity. But now when I'm going between these two routes, /dashboard/account and settings, this part isn't having to get recomputed. So server components do this fancy thing where when I'm going between these two different pages, let me clear this out. So we're going to increment this value and we're going to go to settings. And we go to settings, we fetch this new, and of course this would be different if I'm running a production build versus the dev output, but I go to /settings and you get back this weird like RSC thing. What is this? What is this strange format inside of here? This RSC payload is kind of the glue or the sauce between the server and client components. It can do a lot of things for you, and it's not that you necessarily need to go dig into this response, but it is the magic that's allowing this state and this client component as I go between these two worlds, right, to not have to get re-rendered. And this can lead to some pretty nice product experiences that you can build with this. I will pause. See the questions we have. Can we talk about hydration errors? We actually just made this quite a bit better with 14.2. You should definitely check that out if you haven't seen it. Before, it used to look like this, which leaves a little room to be desired, in my opinion. It's better now, and it's getting even better. The React team is doing some really great stuff to make hydration better across the whole ecosystem. So shout out to that work. Prefetch with use router on the client. Don't know exactly what you want to do there, but let me know. Preference in terms of testing pages. Do I want to use end-to-end test or RTL? Quick plug for the docs here. We have this testing section, which covers Vitesse, Jest, Playwright, Cypress. It talks about unit testing, end-to-end testing, snapshot testing. Shout out to Delba for writing all of those docs. What are the most common cases for templating? If you mean the template special file, it's a pretty uncommon case. I don't know if you just mean like templating in general. Does the layout also support meta tags? Yes, we're going to talk about this. We're going to get into metadata as well too, because this is definitely a common question that I've seen. Can we override the root layout? For example, we have a nested layout where we wanted it to have its own nav without taking the root layout. Yes, I'm glad we're cooking on some good stuff here because you're asking all the right questions and the things that I want to cover. The things that I want to cover over here. Maybe I need to move faster through my through my list. Yeah, route groups. Route groups is coming in here as well too. Okay, let's go check the YouTube chat. Yeah, route nesting. 100% ready to get into that. Should I always use the server for data fetching? You don't always have to. I think there's advantages of using data fetching on the server and preventing client waterfalls, but there's certainly a time and a place for client data fetching as well too. Can I generate a list of routes? You can read the file directory to look at page files. There isn't a built-in tool for this. Let's see. Shopping cart, even in the layout. Yeah, shopping cart's a good idea for something that could be in the nav bar, going back to that state example. Another question on hydration errors, suspense, need docs for UI testing with Storybook. Yeah, the Storybook team's been doing some good stuff here in terms of adding support for all Next.js features, so definitely check that out. Speak in little less English accent so I can understand. You know, it's funny. I'm from the Midwest in the United States, and a lot of people say that Midwesterners have like the least amount of American accent. Like we don't have a Southern accent. We don't have a New York accent. We don't have like a Valley accent. It's just kind of like Northern Midwest. You have the Wisconsin and you have some accents up there as well too. But in Iowa, it's like a lot of newscasters come from Iowa, I've heard, because they have no accent. Axios or fetch. Yeah. We can get into that as well too. Okay. I'll add a note here. I'll keep cooking here as well too. Okay, let's get to the next part, fetching data. Let's go back to our example. So let's say, well, we'll keep it somewhat large. We've talked about basic routes. We've talked about nesting routes. Now let's talk about fetching data. And this is really where server components shine, is because it makes it really easy for, let's say on my account page, on some nested page inside of here, I want to go fetch information about my account. Well, even though, as a reminder, the parent is a client component. So we've got this situation here where let's do background blue, 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 red. Whoops. Yes. Blue, blue. I feel like that could maybe be better visualized, but hopefully you can still see what I'm cooking. Maybe green's better, and maybe we'll do, I don't know if that makes it hard to read the text, but the cool thing about this is that you can weave server and client components together. And even though this layout, which is the parent of these pages, is a client component, the children of this dashboard layout are server components, and the weaving of those in the model still works really well. So let's say here, dashboard/account, all of a sudden now I want to fetch data in this component. Well, the good news is that I can do just that. So on my account page, to be able to turn this into a synchronous component and actually fetch data, I just throw async on here. And then let's say I want to do, yeah, sure. Oh man, that's a lot of stuff. I don't really want all of that. Yeah. I don't know what's all in there. Let's do, I mean, I have to assume there's a username. So we're gonna try that. So I'm gonna go to api/github.com/users/ in this instance, we're just gonna go lerob, cool, and close that guy out and go back to here, dashboard account. What are we working with here? It is login. So it's not username, it's login. And I could also do, I don't know, let's say avatar URL. Just for the sake of this, let's say I do, there you go. So we turned this component from a just basic presentational component, little throwback language there, to this. Let's do rounded full. Boom. Which is now fetching data from some remote location, and it's including it in the component that gets rendered. Now, the next question to this is, does that have to be a server component? Can I fetch data in a client component? You can fetch data in a client component. You can't do it with this async notation, but you could just as easily have done function, avatar, data. Let's do user set, user, whoops, use effect. Cool, that's good enough. You could have easily just done this approach in a client component where you are doing the traditional way of having some state, having an effect. The effect calls an external API or an API route in your application. This can be, hand-rolled use state, use effect. It can be tan-stack query. It can be SWR. It can be whatever you want. This doesn't go away, and this still works with the existing model. It's not that that's replaced by any means. There are just new options that allow you to not have to do a lot of that setup yourself. So yeah, you don't have to do that. Now I think one of the other questions in here was, okay, I'm fetching data in a server component and I have a layout here. I have a layout it's denoted by the use client directive. So I got a use client directive that passes me into the client boundary. And even though I can weave between the client and the server boundary where I jump into the portal of the client world here, but I can still have my root layout render and kind of pierce through the hole and put these server components in here. Does that mean that for these pages, I have to do use server? Use server sounds like the opposite of use client, right? I want to use the server to do some work. Well, the answer is, I go here, everything works fine, right? I click on this, increment the count, I go back, everything seems fine. Is this the way I'm supposed to do it? The answer is no, you don't have to use server to denote the functions that you're fetching data with. Instead, when you want to use the server, you're using it for server actions. And server actions are like the mutations in your application. You can think of it like a TRPC or like calling some endpoint. You're going into the server boundary, you're going into the server world because you want to scaffold out an API. And we can show that as well too. But just to call that out more specifically, you don't need to use server at the top there to make a component that fetches data. So if you're unnecessarily adding those, you can remove those from your application. They won't do anything there. The next question from y'all was Axios or fetch, or is there a specific way I need to fetch my data? We could go really in depth on fetching, and I know that fetching and pages and layouts are related. The only thing I will say is there isn't really, in my opinion, a great reason to use Axios. Fetch has gotten really good. It's portable between different frameworks. It's the web API. You can use it in a bunch of places. So if you learn fetch, you can take that knowledge elsewhere. I think the real case of not using fetch is when you have, database.users.something. Like you're not actually using fetch, you're going directly to a database, or there's some abstraction on top of there. And the combination of how you use data fetching and how you render your pages depends on whether you want your page to be static or dynamic. And right now, when I'm running in my local application, I'm fetching some data in this component. If I change this to someone else and I reload the page, I get new data. It's showing me what this environment looks like to evaluate these components, right? But if I go back here, one of the misconceptions about about server components in general, but about the app router as well too, is that you have to do a dynamic application. You have to do a server application because server components, right? Which I totally understand where that misconception would come from. In reality, it's kind of the opposite. By default, what Next.js is going to do, I like Dan's framing of like there's two Reacts, which is just a helpful way to think about entering into this new mental model. There's the React that runs on my computer, which it just happened. It ran in the terminal. And then there's a React that runs on your device or in the browser. And even though I'm using server components, I'm taking advantage of the server for building my application, it ran on my computer, right? I ran a build and I generated these pages and I went in here, and if I do, well, you can even see by this little icon, I know my comments are hiding it there for a second, but you see these icons, static, down here at the bottom, these are statically generated during a build, which means they're not going to get recomputed. So if I start my production server and I reload the page, this doesn't compute dynamically on the fly. And you might be wondering, okay, that seems to make sense. But what about when I do want this to update dynamically every single time? How do I think about that world? If I go back to here, I'll start my dev server again. There's two things to take into consideration here. Again, I could go way more in depth on fetching data, but you can make it such that your fetch does not do that. So for here, you want to say, you know what, actually, for this, we're going to say that we want cache no store, and just don't do that. Let's let this evaluate every single time. Sometimes you do want this to run, maybe you want to fetch some data from the YouTube API. You don't want it to be dynamically evaluated. You want it to be cached. Sometimes you don't want it to be cached. And that's one way to opt out. The other, I think probably more common thing is when you're doing let database call equals database 08 db dot something like this. When you're doing a call like this, by default, Next.js doesn't know what to do with this promise. So this is going to be dynamic by default, right? You're going to have to go fetch some data, and it doesn't know whether it can be static or dynamic. But if you want to make this cached, Next.js includes a function called unstable cache that you can use, where you basically just put this inside of here. Yeah. There's a little bit more to it in terms of you can also specify how long or how much you want this to be revalidated and what the cache keys are and such. But just to quickly mention that you can do that. That is possible. Let me know if you want to see another video where we go much more in depth on fetching and caching. I have one video on the YouTubes, but there's a lot more that we can cover there. There's more I want to talk to. So next, let's talk about metadata and where you can render metadata. But first, let's swing back over to the chat. Client-side data fetching. Let me know if the client-side data fetching thing answered your question there in terms of just using normal use effect. What theme do I use on VS Code? One Dark Pro Darker. Trying to pull next auth in a layout and building a dynamic page. Headers was called outside of request scope. So quickly just on this, when you're using a library like next auth or you're using database calls, you're inherently doing something that's dynamic, which means that under the hood, if they're already adapted and built for Next.js app routers, they use these functions like headers or cookies where they're accessing parts of the incoming request. If you want to learn more about this, YouTube Vercel. If you want to learn more about this, I just made a video here, Next.js explain how cookies uses async local storage, that explains a little bit more about how these things work. So check those out in case you're curious. But if they're already using those, they have to access the request, which is dynamic inherently, which means that part of the page it's going to have to be dynamic. That's why you're getting that error that's saying hey, hold up, just so you know, that's a dynamic part of your application. RBAC. We talk about RBAC a little bit in the auth docs, but that's a deeper rabbit hole for sure than probably what we'll get into today. Client-side data fetching from a database. Yeah, just to quickly go into that as well too, because I think I have seen this misconception a couple times. Let me go back and let's see if I can get my... So you don't do client-side data fetching from a database here. You have to have some external API or /API/ whatever, because this is running in the browser. And if you were going to go directly to a database, if you were going to do database dot something here, that would mean that somewhere where you set up your database, you also passed in process.env. The code completion is smarter than we give it credit for, because you would have to do next public to expose the value to the client side. We intentionally made this decision such that you have to opt in to say, yes, I intend that this environment variable should be available in the browser. You want to do this. You don't want people to have your database URL, but this is not possible because it has to run securely on the server side. That's why you can't go directly to the database from the browser. What would be the best way to migrate endpoints from Pages API? You can actually keep them in Pages API if you want. So you can keep them. Why are we marking it as unstable? We think we have a better way of handling this API that we'll share more soon. The same underlying idea remains. We just think there's a more ergonomic way of writing it. We've got some feedback on like the key parts thing. That's a little bit confusing, which I also agree with, by the way. So we want to make it better, and we also want to do so in a way that gives you code mods or gives you ability to easily move to these new features without making it some large rewrite. So we will provide documentation, code mods, and a bunch more information on this as we figure out exactly what we want that structure to look like. We're just not there just yet. So still unstable for now. In terms of the API, right? In terms of the functionality is fine. Best practices for accessing URL search params in a deeply nested server component. We're going to get into this. Yep, this is on the list, so I'm glad you're here. On the YouTube side, let's see what y'all are saying. When should we use suspense besides server components? We can talk about that a little bit. Sitemaps, I probably won't get that today, but we have some docs on this. Do we need SWR? It depends. I mean, Tanstat query, SWR, use effect, client-side data fetching. There's still valid reasons for wanting to fetch information on the client. I will say that the server, the app router model does enable you to remove a layer of caching and remove a layer of setting up your own API endpoints if you kind of buy into all of the features. But that might not be how it works if you have an existing API or the existing team that's already working on it, or you're building across web and mobile, for example. So there's more to consider than just that. Parallel routes, yes, we're going to cover this. Won't get into middleware today, but maybe in another time. Theming we won't get into today, or draft mode. I'm sorry, y'all. There's a lot to cover. More videos on data fetching. Yeah. Okay. That Vercel drip. I still use Pages. Hey, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with still using the Pages router, by the way. It's totally fine. I saw something about cookies recently. Well, we can talk about cookies as well, too. All right, next on the list, metadata. This is one I've seen quite a few questions about. Do I have to use server components to define metadata? Can I use them in client components? Can I define things in the head? Let's talk about this because there's been a few questions on this. Let's go to the settings page instead of this component here. So let's go here. Okay, so we have our server component. And right now, you might notice the title of the page is Next.js parallel. Next.js parallel routes example. This is actually being inherited from our root layout. So the Next.js has this built-in metadata API that allows you to compose metadata through all different pieces of your application. So I can have metadata in my root layout, but I can also define it and override it and merge the keys when I'm way further down in my tree, down here in settings/page. So for example, let's say I copy this. We've got a title. Go here. I can get rid of this. Now let's say in here, JK, we want to say that this is settings. That's the title of this page. Now, if you look over here on the right, you see the title of our page updated to settings. And if I open up the DOM and I go look at the head, we can see right here the title of settings. But we also see the description that came from the root layout metadata. So these two objects, the title from here overrode the key from here, and we still use the description from this root layout. Now you can do some interesting things with this. I can probably click into this interface metadata and dig into here as well too. I think one interesting thing is templates. Let's see if there's a good example of this in here. For your, let's see. I don't know, maybe it'll help me out as I type it. I think you make it an object. I can't remember actually. Is it that? No. Let's go look at the docs. Let's not guess. I'm going to have to go to the full reference here. Title. Okay. It is an object. I'm a silly person. So there's a template that you can use. The reason why I wanted to mention this is because I feel like it would be a little interesting in this example. So let me go here. We're going to do template. I'm guessing, is this because I didn't have a default? Absolute. Absolute is missing. Okay. Let's do that. And let's do home. Okay, now let's go to here. So now when I go to here, when I look at my default, it's just home. So we're on the home route. But when I go to these nested routes, we have a template string and we're able to do settings, which was defined down here. And then we have this, we want them all to be prefixed, or sorry, to be suffixed with Next.js parallel routes example. Now there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do with like basically every single possible option that you want to do with metadata. It's all possible here. You can do any single option that you want, but you might ask then, okay, well, can I just do this metadata right here? This like meta tag description. Can I just put this in my head? Like, is that fine? The answer is yes, you can still do this. So for example, let's say I go and let's do, let's do a div. And whoops, and I want a head. And we'll say the description is my fancy settings page, and then we'll actually keep that H1 settings. Cool. Now we go back to here. We reload the page. Let's see. What do we got here? Oh, well, yeah. Wait. This is great. This is fantastic. I get to actually show the hydration. I did bad HTML, and Next.js is shaming me for my HTML skills. It says, this is the first time I've used it in the wild. Hydration failed, which I'm sure many of you have seen this docs page before. But it's telling me that I put this H1 in my div. Why did I do that? Huh? Why would I do that? So let's do a section. There you go. Amazing. That's funny. I ran into that. So you're going to notice something here, which is that, yeah, I can still throw a meta tag in here. It will go into the head of my DOM. But what the metadata API is doing is a number of things. One, it is composing these together for you. So it's kind of deduping the objects. It's like resolving key merging. But also, if I have something on the page that is using suspense, so I have some data fetch and I'm delaying showing, I don't know, a list of users in my dashboard. But maybe inside of there's also some metadata that I want to send as well too, but it's waiting on that data fetch. When you use the metadata API, it also works in that case as well too, which is nice that it's just built into the framework so you don't have to do it yourself. But I think there's this question around like, I just want to throw things in the head. You still can, but in general, I find the metadata API to be nice because not only do you have that, but now like I was getting those TypeScript errors earlier, or if I do description, but I actually fat finger it, I'm going to get the in error feedback here. Or like I was doing earlier, I can dig into the JS doc for each one of these as well too. Why is H1 inside div considered a hydration error? It is incorrect HTML. Can I use it within a server action? I'm not sure what you're asking there. Is there a way to append the page title? So my app for /settings, and I think that's what I just showed. Let me know if append the page title. Yeah, I think that's exactly what I was showing with templating. When will PPR be stable? We'll talk a little bit about partial pre-rendering later. Can you show the way to set the status code? We can talk a little bit about status codes. Dynamic metadata. Yeah, let's talk about that quickly. What other questions? Congrats on getting streaming to X2 now. Just jumping in. Yeah, where's my X streamers at? If you're streaming on X, throw me a reply to this. I don't actually know how I would follow along. Oh, this is classic X. It's either nudes in bio, nudes in profile, some scam money thing as well too. I always click it because I'm like, wait, maybe this was actually something good. No. They also have like AI generated Explorer stuff on the side now too, which I find really interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I think the chat, these aren't replies, so it does get a little confusing. Yeah, it came from X. The interaction there sucks. Yeah, the chat is definitely easier on Twitch and YouTube if you want to interact. So try to keep both on there. Rumor is that 14.2 isn't stable. Do not actually trust it, just that. Yeah, there was a bug with Windows and Next font that we already patched in 14.21. So if you're on Windows, make sure you go to 14.21. But in general, my guidance is usually it's better to wait like a day when updating to the latest version of any framework, because you release it, a bunch of people download it, test it out, then the good stewards of the open source community open up issues. They say, hey, I was on 13.5, I updated to the latest, I ran into this issue, we patch it, we fix it, and then the first patch release is usually then like, you're good to roll. I've got a full pint of water at my desk at all times. We gotta stay hydrated out here. I'm doing a lot of talking. We gotta be drinking our water, our hydration homies. Let's see. Single export type for everything in Next.js. I think that can be problematic because it's harder to do the dead code elimination if it's all in one single like import from Next. What would I suggest to abstract API calls? Where I want to do the first default fetch server side and then continue on the client. Tanstack Query and SWR have this built in, I'm pretty sure, where you can do the first pass in the pre-render on the server, and then you kind of forward the initial data over to the Tanstack Query or SWR or whatever. It's pretty weird that H1 can't be in a div. HTML is weird, man. I feel you. Okay, let's keep rolling. I think the last thing that we were on was dynamic metadata, because inside of here, maybe I want this to be actually just a, I have a better example. Rather than this page, let's go to the account page. On the account page, and let me shrink this bad boy down a little bit here. On the account page, I'm fetching data. I have a server component fetching the user, but then maybe I also want that username to be in my metadata. Maybe I want to say Lee's account, right? Lee Rob's account. So what we can do is, in the same way that the Next.js metadata API can merge those objects together, we can do the same thing for dynamic metadata. And there is this generate metadata function, and it's going to return an object that looks the same as the objects that you do when you statically define it as well too. Now, this brings up a good question around caching, deduplication, because the same data I want to fetch in here, the same promise I want to make, is the same as here. So what I can actually do is, let's just say I want to take this, and we're going to say function get user, and then we're going to return the login. I mean, we could just return that whole object if we wanted to. We don't have to destructure and then put it back together into an object. Let's just do, yeah, let's just do that for my sanity. Let's do return. So we have await function get user. We go in here. Yep, got that. Whoops. But now inside of generate metadata, we can call the same thing. And because this is going to be cached by default, you're not making two calls to that API. Or if you're using a database call here and you want to deduplicate that as well too, we'll talk about that in a second. But I want to do, let's do, yeah. Yeah. That looks good. I spelled it wrong, but that looks good. I also need to export. Whoops. Export async function generate metadata. So now, oh, I forgot oh, there we go. Okay, so now in the title, I see Lee Rob's account, Next.js parallel routes example. You just ignore that little bit right there. Now there's a good question, which is, it seems strange that I call my data here in this component, but then I also have this function where I'm also calling my data, or I'm making this promise. It seems like Next.js is inviting me to make these separate calls. And the answer is intentionally yes, because there's different types of metadata. There's metadata that is like blocking the page from being shown, what we call in Next.js as the viewport metadata. So like I'll just open this up in here. Like the character set or the viewport content. You've seen this before, right? Width, device width, initial scale 1. It's like the boilerplate that's included by default in every HTML5 template in the world. It's also the default metadata that's included with Next.js out of the box, so you don't have to configure this. That needs to be there before you stream in any content. But then there's other document metadata, like the description or the title, that actually can stream in later. And part of the design of splitting these two things up is to enable that streaming world. And we give you utilities to be able to kind of dedupe across these things. So let's say, for example, let's say inside of here that this was db.user.find1 login Lee Rob or something. So now this is dynamic, right? It's not going to be deduplicated by default because we're doing some dynamic call to my database or to somewhere else. But I have these two calls, and I want to deduplicate them on the server. Well, one of the nice things is, let's see if I can pull up a little example here. We have this thing in our docs called data fetching patterns, and it shows a couple examples of these patterns. And one of the functions you can use is called the React cache function. The React cache function, it's like memoization for the server. It's deduplication for the server. It's for a request, for a given request. If I call generate user 100 times, just only call it once. Call it once, save that value, and then don't call it again, basically. So for example, let's say I go in here, I take this, and now you can see here, the structure of this, it is taking some promise, but I'm wrapping it with the cache function. So let's say it's like this. And I don't know, maybe we do something with the data. Maybe we just return this directly. Cool, this is like get user from DB or something like this. Now, every single time I call it, actually just to make this even more realistic, is it passes in a parameter, which is part of the cache key. And it goes and it fetches it from here. And now inside of here, we're doing await, or we're just calling get user from DB, and then we're passing in whatever thing we want here. And I guess maybe this is like a little bit too stretched, because this whole function could have just moved up into here. So rather than this, we could do like, something like that. That's also an option. So it's just showing an example of what it is trying to help you do. It's going to call it once, and then it gets deduped across the request. I'll pause. Pause. Where are we at now? Are you using VS Code for streams, but really using Cursor? No, I'm using VS Code. I've also been exploring using Zed. Zed. I don't you love the design of this? I'm really liking the design of Zed. It's super clean. Like, I like my color scheme and my font inside of here. So I have been, this is my, what I'm using on the side, and it works pretty good. Their new support for Git is getting better. I think it's, you can now toggle Git blame, so I can see all the mistakes I made 5 months ago or a year ago. So it's getting better, but it's still not ready for the prime time yet, but I am exploring using it. It's only cached for the user's requests, correct? Yes, for deduping. Let's see. What happens when roaming takes too long? The next page gets data, the user stays on the same page for 20 seconds. After a click? Sounds like maybe you have some kind of blocking data fetch that when you're transitioning between pages, you're waiting for that to happen. So it sounds like you might want to explore use optimistic there. Are there plans for supporting the lang attribute on generate metadata for I18N? We're going to talk about this as well too. Do you have query params in generate metadata? You don't, but you can do parallel routes, which we're going to talk about. Is that a key-based cache? Yeah. So the arguments for the React cache dictate the key. Other questions. How do we migrate a big project from Pages Router to App Router? I would recommend doing it very incrementally. Take one route at a time. Both can coexist at the same time in your application. You don't have to move it all at once. Yeah. Not getting any hydration errors, figuratively and literally. Okay. Let's keep rolling. Going back to here. So we talked about metadata. We talked about using the head. I wanted to also mention authentication, because this one has came up a little bit in terms of kind of the best practices for where I should do my authentication, because you might think, I'm just going to revert this back to, yeah. You might think that I have to do authentication in some middleware because I want it to apply to all routes in my application. Like everything in my app is behind login, so I'm going to put it in middleware. That's going to be the place that I enforce the authentication logic. And that's not actually the best way of doing it. Instead, I would recommend having a data access layer, or a DALI, as Pitbull likes to say. And the reason for this is because you can kind of co-locate all of your backend data fetching, authentication, authorization. Someone else asked about RBAC. Like, you can put all of that logic together in one place in your application that you could also then, if you wanted to, even expose that through an API endpoint and use it somewhere else as well too. You're co-locating all of that logic in a singular place. What that means is, let's say I have some file like this, and I have, and more realistically, it's probably in a server action. You could have your data access layer separate, and then your server action calls that data access layer. Let me pull up. I think we have it in the docs in here. Yeah. So in here, we talk about, while middleware can be useful for initial validation, it should not be the sole defense of protecting your data. The bulk of security checks should be performed in your data access layer. So you want to consolidate everything there to have consistent data access, to minimize authorization bugs, and to simplify maintenance. So server actions or route handlers can then call your data access layer. So for example, let's say in here, we'll do actions dot, I can't type. We'll do actions.ts. So these would be my server actions, which we mentioned this earlier in the stream, but this is actually where the use server directive comes in, because these are essentially exposed APIs, right? So a little copy pasta here, like just to show you have use server, you've denoted that this file, all of the exports in here are going to be server actions. And for this one, let's say I want to save data. So I've got some promise, some async function here. Well, the first thing I want to do, and is the best practice, is you have to think about each one of these functions like they were an exposed API. So you still should be checking your authentication. You should be checking your authorization. You should be checking what the roles are. So we get the session, we pull off the role. If they're authorized to perform the action, we allow them to proceed forward. Otherwise, we'll throw an error, or we'll do something else with our control flow to point the user to the right spot in our application. But common mistake I've seen as folks are warming up to server actions is not including the authorization or authentication logic in these functions. And these can be, you can abstract these in any way you want. These could be higher order functions that like wrap other functions. They can just be, calls like get user, or user has role, and then be done. Maybe in the future, there's a world where it uses like decorators as well too, if that ever becomes a standardized thing. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that as well. That's really all I needed to say. That's my TED Talk. Okay, params and search params. Let's get into this. So I'm going to, well, we can leave this because we might come back to it. Let's go to the settings page. So I'm going to get rid of this. And let's say that inside of here, we want to have another route that's dynamic for the username. So what we're going to do, we're going to take this. No, we're going to copy paste. this is going to be dashboard slash username. And what we actually have is something more like this. It's still using the same layout above, but then below here, even though there's this page, now there's this prop that the page has access to called params. And the params is an object that's going to have whatever the key of the file name is. So I've got params username. Now I have access to use that inside of here. So let's look at an example. I'm going to go to settings page, get rid of this for a sec. Okay, so inside of here, let's make a new folder. We'll call it brackets denote dynamic routes. It's the same in the pages router as well too. We'll call this username. We're going to go in here, new page, page.tsx. Now, in the props for the page, so this is a server component, in the props for the page, we have access to params. And we can go in here and we can say we want params.username. Let's see if this saves. If it saves and there's no formatting errors, then I know I've done something correct. Although, okay, that's better. That was hurting my eyes. So dashboard slash Lee Rob. Okay. So maybe I want just spamming whatever the Tailwind classes it gives me. I mean, really, I just want like margin 4 and I want class name, font, semi-bold. A little bit better. It's slightly better. It appeases me just a little bit. So what have we done here? Well, inside of this server component, inside of this dynamic route, Next.js is able to wire up the URL, which is /dashboard/some dynamic slug, and forward that as props to the component, which we can then use inside of here. And it's not just params as well too. There's also search params. And this works in any server component. Any server component can grab the search params from the incoming request and oops. Search. Yeah. So let's say we wanted to have like, I don't know, show modal. Sure. This is just the typing, and we can change the search params. We actually have really good types for this in our page file, I believe. There's a lot going on in this type, but it shows all of the possible values of what the search params could be. It could be a string, it could be an array of strings, or it could be nothing. So we could go that complex, or you can, like, if you want to narrow down specifically what you're expecting, you could also do that as well too. I mean, either one works for the sake of this. Sure, we'll do that. Now maybe inside of here we want to do yeah, let's do that. Test equals 2, or taco equals tasty. I don't know. Like, what? I don't know. Something like that. But you can access those from inside of the components just by reading from those params. Now, the question that y'all asked, what the FAQ was, how do I access those somewhere else? So I've got my page, right? And sometimes you want to make this page a client component. But there's two things that are kind of leaning you or pushing you in the direction to maybe not do that. And I think the feeling is it a bad thing if I have both a server and client component? For example, maybe I want to use params and search params, right? And maybe I want to use metadata. I want to do something like this, where these things are only available in a server component, but then inside of here, I've got, some function. I've got some client thing inside of here. It's just spamming stuff. I've got some client thing inside of here that uses use state or use effect or something else. So I've got this, and now all of a sudden it's like, hold up, partner. This needs to be a client component. You need to enter into the client boundary. The way you actually would want to do that, maybe just to go back to, we'll steal this counter component from here. The way you would want to do that is if I have this and I need to use some client component, but I still want to use metadata, I still want to use these, is you just take advantage of more components. So maybe, I don't know, maybe this is called client, for example, but I've got this, and I'm going to say, you know what, we're crossing back into the use client boundary here, even though the parent is a server component. And now, I'll just do counter. And is that what I called it? Oh, you gotta export it. The editor is smarter than myself. So, same thing here, right? Now I get to use this thing that is doing client-side only logic, hooks or custom hooks or something, while still getting to take advantage of some of these server features. Now, one of the other questions that we get is, okay, well, what about hooks? I want to be able to access those values somewhere else, deeper down in my component tree. I don't want to pass props in a bunch of different places. Can I use a hook for that? And we do have use params. Use params is a client component hook that allows you to read the dynamic params filled in by the current URL. So let's go ahead and let's get rid of this. Let's go to here. So we import use params from Next Navigation. We have a function. We'll just call this client. Use params. We're going to say there's a tag and an item. Sure. And let's do this instead. Yeah. So we're going to start with params, and then we'll go to search params as well too. In this instance, tag and the item are not the params. The params we're expecting are username. And let me get rid of all of that and get rid of all of this. Params. Okay, so export default function client. I go back to here. This is now called client. And maybe I don't want to read this from here anymore. Like we can slowly just start to move some of this stuff just so you can kind of see what it's like. So I had params dashboard. So that seems fine. What was this called? Export default function client. Has no, is it, oh, it's a default export now. Not the named export. So that's fine. Let's do, we'll come back to that one. So I'll do this and go here. And yeah, that seems fine. Params is possibly null. Okay. We're back to where we started. So it's kind of the same way of doing what we were doing before, except now we're accessing it with a hook. And to reiterate one of the points from earlier, the client components are still pre-rendered. So this value still gets pre-rendered. It can still be included in the initial HTML that streams to the page, even though I'm using it somewhere further down in my application. It doesn't have to be at the page level as well too. And that's for use params, so like reading the username. But lo and behold, There's also use search params. Use search params is also a client component that lets you read the URL query string from the incoming request. So, for example, it looks similar but slightly different. And in this instance, maybe instead of just JSON dumping the whole thing, we can just do something specifically for search. If we want, let's just take this whole component. So we've got search params, .get search. So if we include search, it should show up there. That all seems fine. Search params is possibly null. Okay. So if search params is possibly null, let's just do that. Actually, I don't know the best way. I wonder what the best way of doing this is. If null, just don't include it at all. Where's my TypeScript experts at? I don't know. I'm fine with either. It doesn't really matter though. If I go back to here, there's one other thing that I need to do, which is I'm using search params. I'm reading something from the incoming request. Next.js is going to complain, rightfully so, if I don't wrap this in a suspense boundary. And this is something that we put in to help prepare for a future world with partial pre-rendering, where you can have parts of your page that are static and parts of your page that are dynamic. What it means for right now is that what I want to do is use suspense and put this inside of here. I imported suspense from React. And now let me get rid of all of these search params. Okay, so we go into here. That all seems fine. Sure. And let's do search equals hello stream. So now I'm able to access the search param from a deeply nested component and include the value here. The only caveat is that I have to make sure that I wrap it with suspense. So that's how that works. That is how that's work. Okay, search params, question mark, null. Is that we think the best, we like this one the best? No? Let's see what other questions we have here. Going up to here. LOL Dali. The migration from pages to app router comes up all the time. It seems like there could be a great agent that could do that. How has that not been built? I feel like we're still on there's still a lot more to be done in terms of agents that are actually repeatable and helpful consistently versus causing you more trouble. I think there's been some good code mods that have made this easier, but in terms of like an entire agent application that's going to run this whole thing for you, I haven't seen one yet that does that well. Is there a way to use React Cache to maintain the cache data through multiple route changes? In this instance, you would use the Next.js version. The Next.js cache, that's like the main difference. The Next.js cache will persist durably, whereas the React cache is fleeting for that request. Similar to how we can use the cookies function, why doesn't Next.js have something similar for getting query params? Getting it only in the pages component and passing it down to other components is kind of unnecessary. Yeah, hopefully I answered that when I showed the hooks that you can use. I'm going to show an example of how you can still use search params and params in React Server Components as well too. It answers this question. 1 second. How should I access search params in deeply nested server components? Yeah, I think I answered that. I'm really loving Fred again. Shout out to Fred again. This is great, but so basic. Any way to make the server faster? Maybe push the await as close to the component as possible. If you're asking for like general ways to speed up server latency, where to start. I guess the first one is ideally you make as much of your page static as possible. That's going to give you the lowest floor for latency. In reality, that's not always possible, right? So then you're wanting to optimize, maybe you have 3 awaits in a row when really they could be ran in parallel. Maybe there's specific calls that could be cached so that they don't have to be called as much. Maybe they can use ISR to periodically revalidate the data versus running them fresh every single time. I mean, if you want to, we can get into more specifics, but some ideas there. Search params and a server component. Yep, we're going to show that. Movie database clone. Would I use fetch? Yeah, I would use fetch. We're going to get to that. Can't use Next.js due to cookies. So there's a common theme between a bunch of these, which is that it's like a bad thing to use a client component. And I just want to reiterate that it is totally fine to use client components, and to do this, it's okay and accepted, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. We already talked, kind of going back to here, we already talked a little bit about should we cache or not. But one of the bits here on params and search params that I want to talk through is with some of the more advanced routing options like route groups and parallel and intercepted routes, they're kind of the solution if you absolutely have to want to be able to access params and search params with a different folder structure. So what I mean is that you're still going to be accessing them from the page, but when you do a route group or a parallel or intercepted route, you can change the folder structure to where you can still access it lower down in the tree. There's not going to be a way, or at least right now, there's not planned to be a way for some arbitrary server component very far down the tree to be able to access params or search params. You should just use a client component for that. But if you want more granularity over this, we're going to talk about this with parallel and intercepted routes, at least breaking up the top. So let me come back to that in 1 second. I want to see if there was other questions. On the YouTube side, is there an option to cache data across multiple requests? Yep, that's the Next.js unstable cache or the fetch caching. Why is the Next.js team using MacBook for development? By the way, just on that, I feel like we do use Windows computers. There was a test, our test suite for Create Next app. It's like kind of hard to set up tests on our Azure pipeline. And they're also pretty slow for Windows, unfortunately. But now it runs the Create Next app test suite as well too. So shouldn't have that problem going forward. But some of the people on the team do use Windows. Can server actions be incremental to save a document to a data store? Absolutely. Is there a way to prevent route changing? For example, to not let the user like lose their progress in filling a form? Yes. If you search for Next.js router events. Yeah, there's an example here where I listed out a bunch of different replies for a bunch of different things where in the past people were using router events from the pages router for. I actually haven't mentioned this yet, but I probably should have mentioned this a little bit earlier. But all navigations in the app router are built on React transitions, which is a newer feature that you don't really use unless you're in framework land. But you can kind of think about it as like you have a version of your UI and then you want to perform some operation. You want to transition to the next version of that UI. You can consider your UI almost like Git, where you can fork off and run some version of the UI and then commit it back into main. That's really what transitions enable, and every single transition in the app router every single navigation in the app router is a transition. Wanted to mention that as well too. What MacBook am I using? I have like a 3-year-old one. I think it was when the M1s came out. How do I know if my component is a server component? Right now, I feel like we could make this more clear, and we're working on some dev tools here, because when you're crossing the client-server boundary, the lack of a use server directive does not mean that it's not a server component. And I think maybe that's why some folks have wanted or felt the intention of putting the use server directive at the top of the file to be like, I know explicitly that this is a server component, but it's kind of fighting upstream, like it's fighting against the intention, which is that you want to be able to weave server and client components. You want to use both, but I definitely agree that we need some better dev tools for like visualizing this, right? Like I want to see this graph somewhere. Why does redirect work by throwing an error? This is a good question. There's a common misconception that try catch is only used for errors, but in reality, it's more than that. It can be used for, I like the framing of control flow. It's like, do I want to go this place or that place? I don't know if that's the best word for it, but that's how I've heard it referenced a few different times. The reason it works this way and why redirect throws an error is because you shouldn't. It's control. It's telling your application to go in a different direction. Like if this is happening, you shouldn't proceed beyond here. And you can, if you really want to, listen specifically for that redirect or for that error that it's throwing. I think we have an example of that in the docs, but it is intentional that it is that way. Like my generalized feedback here is like, don't over try catch your code base. Like don't just throw try catch everywhere because it feels like the best practice of, oh, well, if there's an error here, like maybe I'll have a catch. Be intentional about how you're thinking about how you want to display errors, like React error boundaries, for example. I'm sorry, but you look like Eminem. No, I don't. My knees are not weak. My palms are not sweaty. I do like my mom's spaghetti though. I need to, if I look like Eminem, I would need to grow a much more thick beard, and I would have to be like constantly frowning. He's kind of got that like mean mug on his face at all times. Shout out to Eminem though, if you're watching from Detroit. Is this to a form for search params? Is there something? Holy shit! This has broke my brain. Is there something this is to a form with with get action? What next link is to? I can't. I'm having a stroke. What next link is to the A tag? I honestly, I'm not sure. I gotta keep moving. Does search params opt out of caching? Yes, it does opt out of caching because it opts out of, sorry, to clarify, it opts out of static rendering because you're reading something dynamic from the incoming request. But part of the idea with caching in Next.js is that you can have a more granular cache, so you can still have parts of your page cached even a little bit lower down. More demos on dynamic segments, please. Sure. Server actions have pros and cons. I would recommend using server actions over route handlers. Route handlers are like they are the escape hatch. Like for most things, you should use server actions. Is using Redux with Next.js 14 an anti-pattern? No, I don't think so. I think that for data fetching state, this is like a super old blog post that I wrote. It's out of date now. I wrote this in 3 years ago, in 2021, past, present, and future of React state management. I didn't have good foresight here because I don't know. It talks about some of the history, like initially the Flux libraries, and then React context as a first party primitive, and then all the cool libraries in the ecosystem. And in 2021, there was this like use selected context, and this was like before a lot of the server components ecosystem was really like fully built out. So this was before the React cache function, which I just showed. But like Redux and all these other patterns, there's nothing wrong with them. The thing that the app router is doing is it's giving you server caching state by default. That's fetch, and that's unstable cache. React context, it's giving you the server version of this with the React cache function. For URL state, this is like, it's built into the model. Like you want to read from search params, so you can read the URL state. So I need to update this post to talk through some of that stuff, but yeah. The latest version of PPR, even though it's experimental, very experimental, it does have client-side navigation support. Could you talk about the hydration error that pops up? Upgrade to 14.2, and it will hopefully be a lot more clear, the source of hydration errors. Can I recommend a tutorial to do authentication with a static export? That's going to be like, that model is going to be incompatible, because to do authentication, you need to look at the incoming request, like look at the incoming headers, read cookies. You need something that's dynamic there, unless you're doing it all kind of single page app client side, where you're doing it like a traditional React client only application. That's doable for sure, but in general, I feel like you probably want to use the server for some bits of that to prevent client waterfalls. It's doable. It just depends on what you're trying to build. Where am I from? I'm from Iowa in the Midwest. What is the best way? Try again. Yeah, I'm sorry I butchered that. What's the best way to have a search form not do a full page refresh? So I think what you're asking is, when I submit a form, if I have a form, no, not a foreign object. If I have a form and I have an on submit, and it's going to do, by default, the way forms work in the browser is the page will reload. It will navigate back to the same route. If you do event.prevent default, you're saying, no, please don't do that. I'm taking over control. I'm the captain now. I want to do something different. And that would make it not refresh the page. I don't know if that's what you're asking about. I'm guessing it's not. I'm guessing what you're asking for is like, how do I make it not refresh all of the data on the page? And when you're doing a form with a server action, and let's say it's, save user, and I'm just going to move this in here so my editor stops complaining. And I have function, save user. By the way, you can do this in line if you want. It's probably you probably don't ship that to production. Like you can, but it's best to move it to the data access layer if you want. But I think what you're asking is like, okay, I have a form, I do something inside of here, and then when I save my user, await save data, I want to only revalidate that one specific bit. So inside of here, you can revalidate by tag, and maybe you want that tag to be my user data. And the cool thing here, server actions, is when this form runs, which supports progressive enhancement, when this runs, with or without JavaScript, because this is server component, when this runs and I revalidate in one network round trip, it's bringing back the new UI in my React Server Components payload, and that is coming with invalidated data. So like we said, revalidate tag, like invalidate this, and then, I don't know, assuming that there was another component that was tagging a fetch or tagging some data with my user data, it would fetch that new information and then return it back. So small tangent there. I am skipping. Why are you skipping my quest? What was your quest again? Remind me your quest, and I will come back to it. I am not gay, but I really love Lee Robinson. Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I am married, though. Shout out to my wife. Does anyone know how to use Zod with vanilla JavaScript without breaking it? I'm not sure what they mean by that. In your opinion, what is the place of tools like React Query or SWR? I think they're great. You know, there's still a place for it, especially if you're doing client-only data fetching. How do you tag other data without a fetch? Out of topic, the form action attribute. How do we test this with RTL? I'm not sure with RTL, but I would recommend doing an end-to-end or integration test that actually like clicks the button and treats it like an actual user interacting with the page, and then expect that the HTML elements show up on the page. Or if you want to mock, you know, the API call that you want to make, you can do that as well too. There was a question around how do I add a tag to a non-fetch call, and this is the answer. So on Unstable Cache, the tag is my app user. So this is why this function is kind of confusing, because if you look inside of here, this is this like the parts that make up the cache key, but it is not the cache key that you wait, I'm forgetting how this works. Yes. No, I'm right. Okay. I was like, wait, am I forgetting how this works? No. This is the cache key, the key parts, but it is not the tags, the cache tags that are used to control the invalidation. So the first param is the fetch data, then the key parts, and then the options. So inside of here, we would have something like tags. And then this is why this API is confusing and we want to make it better, but this is like my cache key. And this is the thing that you revalidate. Oh my gosh. This is the thing that you revalidate with revalidate tag. So for those who asked about that. Is the new version of SWR coming out with RSC support? There is one that is coming out that supports streaming. Do I think use optimistic will be widely used in the future? Yeah, it's going to work for client components or client-only applications, as well as when you're integrated in the server components world as well too, which I think is super powerful. Like a Vite application that runs with React and has no server can still use optimistic, which I think is awesome. Will React compiler change anything for Next.js? Just that we want to make it work. It only right now works with Babel. It doesn't work with SWC, but which SWC is the default, by the way. So you have to, it's the Rust-based version of our compiler. So we'll have to add support for that. But for large applications, it might be still worth moving back to Babel to get the React compiler support, probably only for really large applications. Other questions? How do you force clear a cache? By the way, Command-Shift-R, like the browser, clears the cache locally, just so you know. And in general, when people are in this situation, if you're trying to cache things in route handlers, my gut is that you're probably on the wrong path and you should probably be using a server action. Like route handlers truly are the eject button. Like they're not the paved path. Like the paved path is you want to use server actions, but you can still invalidate the cache in a route handler by using revalidate tag or revalidate path. Hey, what's up? Developer AA8. How's it going? I only showed it within a client component, not within a server. Yeah, I mentioned this, and I can show it again, but just to recap this one more time, in a page, you have access to params and search params. So in a server component, you can access them from the page or from the layout, right? Or in a client component, you have use params. Or in a client component, you have use params or use search params. Now the question is, wait, but hold on, I want some deeply nested React server component 20 levels down in my tree, and I want to do something like params that's a server function. And the answer is that's not supported. However, you can use intercepted and parallel routes to get closer to that. It's not going to be exactly what you want, but it might be a little bit better. And maybe I should just keep moving now as well here too. Let's keep moving. Yeah. When I do a revalidate tag, do I only revalidate the query data, or do I refetch all the server component again? You're only recomputing the things that need to be recomputed. So it depends. Like you are invalidating whatever data depended on that tag, and if that means that new data needs to be fetched, then you'll fetch new data. Is use search params, does it always need to be wrapped in a suspense? Yes, it does. Yeah, let me show this example with parallel and intercepted routes. How to fetch data in client components? You can just use effect or SWR. Okay, let's get back to here. I want to get back to what we're going to do is we're going to blow everything away. It's all gone. Everything's gone. And I want to show, let me go back to here, restart my dev server. Okay, it's time to talk, whoa, God, zoom so far in. It's time to talk about what I had started with this demo of parallel routes. So the way this works is you navigate to the index route. It redirects to the default team of Lerob. Navigation and page content are two separate parallel routes. The navigation page fetches and streams the team data server side. So you get to read the dynamic URL path on the server, like team, for example, which gives me Lerob, and then you get to fetch user data information based on that. So going back to here. So let's take a look at the structure here. These are empty folders that can be deleted, so it's not confusing. So now I have this dynamic route, team. And inside of team, I have a parallel route. So I have this layout. I still have let me just go back to the top here. I still have my root layout. But then I have this nested layout. So still have my app, still have my root layout. And what happens in this root layout, let's go, this is not a, this is /team, like this. So this layout is a server component, and inside of here, what it has access to is two different things. It has the children, which is going to be like the page, which you want to have access to team. But then it also, this is where it's rendering the, maybe just to make this more clear. This is where, why did I do that? So this is where it's rendering the children. It's got access to the params. This is the page. But then it's also rendering nav. And nav is this parallel route. So you can think about it. I don't know what's the best way for me to draw this out. We could do it like this, maybe. So inside of @nav, we're able to have another parallel route that has another page file, which means that tying back to that conversation around params and search params, I get to access params and use it to fetch data inside of this server component, even though it's nested further down. And just like in page here, if I want to in here, I can also do params. So this is the like blessed way of accessing params and search params from server components in multiple different places, multiple pages, is by having parallel routes. It's not deeply nested in the tree. If you want to deeply nest it in the tree, then you would want to use a client component. And to reiterate again, client components are okay. It's not a bad thing. They're still pre-rendered. They're fine to have. But if you want this type of setup, parallel routes can be very interesting and helpful here, because if you look at this setup, this is the home dashboard page content. That is this. Just to make this more one-to-one with the example. Like the children here this is the home dashboard page content. So that's like this whole thing. This is a page, right? And then this whole thing is a page. It's pretty mind-bending. Like it is an advanced pattern for sure. But once you understand why this exists, it makes sense why there's some constraints in the other things like params and search params. Because in that case, then you should go into this advanced pattern, even if you don't need to. Sometimes you might want a client component for those, but if you have this option if you're trying to keep it all on the server. So the children go here, and then you can go between these two different routes. They're both rendered here in this component. And one is nav, and it's also the page route. You can do your fetching inside of here. There's a lot more that you can do with parallel and intercepted routes. Let me see if I can find modal nav. Vercel, GitHub Vercel, modal. Yeah, this thing. We made this demo. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. This is a demo that existed a while ago that we updated for advanced routing capabilities in Next. So the way this works is that when you navigate to the application, when you navigate within it, photos get rendered as a modal, but then when you refresh, they render as standalone pages. This is another example of parallel and intercepted routes. So I go in here, I have my route layout, I have a page, which is just rendering out some photos. Each one of them has a link, and then it renders the ID of the photo. I have this photos/ID route, where this is where I can navigate directly to them. And then I have this parallel route for @modal. So here, I have 6 different things. I click on 5. I get to pop this as a modal, and I'm like going to this /photos/5 route. I can go back and navigating between these different routes like this. But if I'm on 3 and I refresh the page, it's the same route /photos/3, but I'm going to the standalone version. You're kind of like peeking into the route here. You're not going to the full thing, and you're showing a different UI based on it, and then I can navigate in here and do something differently if I want to. So in this case, I feel like this is a little confusing at first. This is a little small. Like it's a little confusing at first with this default null, but I think it makes sense the more you get into it. So I have this photos route with some ID. And what happens is when I peek into it, I'm peeking into this modal component, which is used by the page. These are basically, like this modal is the bulk of it, but it's just used by the page. So when I'm peeking into 5, That's the Next.js router saying, hold on, let me take control here. We're going to render this, we're going to render this modal. But if I navigate directly, I want to go to photos/ID, and I want it just to throw this ID out in a card. This is also like a very advanced pattern that will be fantastic for certain UIs. It's very hard to do this when you're trying to build that pattern without something built in, but not everyone needs that level of flexibility and functionality. But I think it's cool that it does exist as a more advanced pattern. Other questions? Can I read your previous question? Yeah, I think I just talked about that. Yeah, I just talked about that. Could you explain use cases for parallel routes? Well, I mean, this is one. We have a couple other, I think, better, we have a couple other better examples. Some better examples and some better diagrams in the docs here. Simultaneously or conditionally render one or more pages within the same layout. Dashboards, feeds on social sites. So this is kind of why I was mentioning, like, if your constraint is that you are trying to use a server component at the top of this part of the tree where A is here, you can build a UI that has the layout bar on the left, the root layout maybe on the top, and then you have these two parallel routes between A and B where you still get to access all the things that you get at the page level, the params option, the search params option, it's all there, right? Let's see. I think there's some more examples in here. Another cool thing that you can do with this is conditional routes. So in the example that we were showing, both of the parallel routes, nav and children, were being rendered out at the same time. But we actually have the ability to be able to conditionally change what we're showing. So maybe instead of here, we want to have some role-based check where if the user is an admin, we show one page, or if they're not an admin, we show a different page. I think that's an interesting use case for this as well too. Another one is tab groups. So this is kind of an example of what we were building with this, where you could also imagine even that these tabs are different parallel routes. And then modals. I think modals is the last example I showed there. There's probably more, but I think these make the most sense out of the group. But again, this is more of an advanced pattern, but it's helpful to know that it exists, I think. Let's see. Do I have any video or resource on revalidating cache data in the whole project? If you want to revalidate all of the data, in your application, you can do this: revalidate path, and then the root layout. Basically, you invalidate everything else down from there. Can I add BGC to the layout just for representing in the diagram? BGC. What is BGC? Should I know what that is? I'm not sure what that is. Should I fetch data with server actions? Server actions are not for fetching data. They are for mutating data in general. I think if you're an advanced user, which maybe some of you are in the chat, you can return JSX from server actions. I just don't think most people are doing that yet. So I think usually when people are saying, can I fetch data, what they're really looking for is a server component. I ran into a scenario where I had to set a cookie when a user visits the page. You can't set cookies from inside RSC, so I put it in middleware. But after I set the cookie in middleware, I try to receive the same cookie in RSC, but I won't get the updated value. Yeah, so middleware and an arbitrary React server component are not going to have parity between setting and reading the exact same cookie values. So if you need to guarantee that you're reading a fresh cookie on every single request, then having that check in middleware makes sense. In general, when I see people in this situation, they're trying to do something with auth and middleware, and that's probably not the right place to do it. Unless you want to do like JWT refreshes, then that can be fine. I have a video on my channel where I show how to do build your own auth, basically, and we talk a little bit about this. Change the background color so I can... Oh, okay. Change the background color. Yes. Let's... So, nav... we'll do 500 and we'll do background green 500. There you go. Hopefully that's helpful. So the red is the nav component, and then the green is the page component. And then I also have the layout that's just rendering them side by side, basically. I guess this is specifically for the team component. If I want to do like the entire page, let me go. That's a little bit better of a realization. And I think for this one too, if I didn't do, I could get rid of the, we're going to lose our margin auto. No. Whatever. I think that makes sense. Thank you, but I'm expecting background validation to revalidate. I'm expecting revalidate tag to revalidate cache data everywhere. For example, changing the website name in the admin panel. Must change it on the landing page also. So in that case, you would want to make sure that you're tagging every place that needs that data with the same cache tag so that when you revalidate by tag, they also get invalidated. Or you can revalidate multiple paths at the same time. If you're seeing stale data when navigating between routes, I don't know exactly what you're doing in that application, but if it's stale data between routes, what you might want is stale times. So we've added the ability to be able to configure this, and you can set these stale times to turn off the client router cache. The client router cache helps it be snappy when you navigate between routes, but depending on the type of UI you're trying to build, you might not want that. And I don't know exactly how you're building that, but check that out if so. What happens to the layout when a link in the tab group is clicked? Right now, inside of here, I think so. We don't really like right now. These are just hard coded to like nothing, but we could do some other kind of route inside of here where instead of this page, that this is the home page dashboard content, we could do /integrations or something as well too, and then make that the click from there. Let's see, let me go back to here. I'm a maintainer of Open Targets, an open source health research project. We were thinking to migrate from a Vite single page app to Next running GCP. We found app writing quite complex. Do you think it makes sense to migrate to page router? So are you saying go from app router to pages router? I think probably not. I think my experience with the app router has been probably a shared feeling with you all, which is the first couple times I used it, I was definitely confused. I think it took me a little bit to understand why things were the way they are, because it was different from, especially like I had the curse of knowledge of having built Next.js and React applications before. If I had no knowledge about how to build any of this and I was starting from scratch, I think it would have been a lot easier to understand. But since I did know how things worked, I had to unlearn. And unlearning is a little bit harder as well too, especially if you've been building a single page app, React app, where the patterns for building are just a little bit different. And that's not to say that you can't build a single page app with React, with Next.js. You can. It's just the patterns and the way that the framework is pushing you towards or incentivizing you to do, they're just a little bit different. You get to take advantage of the server for more features. Have I showcased parallel routes? Yes. Is it good practice to fetch data using route handlers Git? So a couple of people have asked this, so I'm just going to show, because in general, like, you really don't need to use route handlers. I'm going to get rid of those background colors because they're driving me nuts. Let's say that, okay, so we've got this button. This component, well, I generated it with V0, which is cool, and I tweaked it. But this component is a server component. I've got a feedback button. And let's say inside of here, we want this to call something. We want to do some kind of mutation. The way that we've been building React applications forever is that you do this with a client-side event handler. So for example, let's just call this form. I'm going to take this out to here. We're going to do export default function form, return, paste this here, and then we're going to do form. We're going to grab this button from here, and we're going to import it at the top, export default function form. Okay, go back to here, fix this import. Okay, I've done nothing except I've moved this into its own file. Now, the way we would do this most of the time is like, I could either do on click, right? I could do an event handler there, or I could use a form, which I would recommend. Forms are great. And I could say on submit, and on submit is some event handler, and maybe I want this to be a separate function on submit. Cool. So let's do something like this. And inside of on submit, what I really want to do is send some feedback, put it to my database, call an API, do something else there. So what I probably then have is const data equals set data. Sure. Something like that. And then inside of here, we're going to say await fetch API feedback. So this is like typically what this looks like is I have an event handler. I call it from the client side. I do some fetch. I call /API/feedback. I pass in the data here, and then I update my React state locally with, maybe, I don't know, maybe I get back some response here. I mean, in this case, maybe I wouldn't get anything back, but sure, just like putting the example of what this could look like. So then you go over here and you say, all right, I'm going to make a new folder, API/feedback. And then inside of here, I'm going to do route.ts, because I'm used to this. I get it. I'm used to this. This is the way I was building this interaction for forms in the pages router. So let me just give it a little copy pasta here. I have this get. It takes in a web request, and then I want to do something with that web request. So maybe this is like, I don't know, await db.save, whatever, and then I return some response. And I'm going to pause for a brief second and explain why the heck this is up here at the top. Route handlers are the foundation of everything else in the app router. So a page and a layout, they kind of extend the route handler in some ways. So all of the route segment configuration options like this, the caching, setting revalidation times, like all of that stuff, it's the exact same on a route handler, which means that by default, pages get pre-rendered. So it's not really an API in the sense that you would expect an API is always dynamic all of the time, because that's how the mental model for every API ever works. It's not really an API. This is like the most raw version of a page where it's a request handler. Like a request comes in and I do something with it. And that request can happen during the build or it can happen on a device. So if you actually want it to function like an API that's dynamic every single time, you have to either manually opt out or read from the incoming request, which will opt out for you. Side tangent over. Going back to here, you do this dance, you do your little dance where you call your API, you save to the database, you return it back to here. Like this is, the way a lot of folks have been building single page apps, React apps for a long time. What server actions are doing, and why I'm saying like you should just use server actions, you don't need to use route handlers, is you get to just remove all of this. So let's get rid of that event handler. Let's get rid of that state. Let's get rid of onSubmit, which, by the way, this whole thing would have needed to be a client component if we wanted to use an event handler, but it's a server component for right now. And instead, I want an action. And this action, I want to save to DB. And now this function, save to DB, this function I can define inline here. I can define it in my data access layer. I can put it in a separate file. I can do whatever I want. All this is doing, really, is it's automatically scaffolding the API for me. I don't need to make this. I don't need to do this indirection where I make the separate file over here for my API. I can just delete all of that. And I go back to here. And I go back to here. And I click feedback. And it's not in my browser console output. It's in my server output. This isn't an event handler running in the browser. It's over here in my node server on the left. So in general, server actions are the way. But couldn't you call a server action instead of doing a fetch to your own API? You can. You can still do that. And that's also fine. Like you might, let's say that, let's say that you have this and you have this and you do export async function, save to database. You can either keep this in line here or you can move it up to the top of the file, like in my actions file. And that makes all of the exports server actions. So I've got save to DB, right? Now inside of here, let's say that actually I did have some other stuff in this file that made it a client component. But I don't want to have to write that manual API endpoint again. Well, the good news is that you can still compose client components and server actions. And it only works through imports. So you're not forwarding these as props. You are using the bundler to your advantage. You're importing a server action, and that's giving you the ability to call into the server world from the client world. So I have a form action. Actions work on the client and the server. In React 19, you'll be able to use actions without a server, just in completely client-only applications. And I can still save to database, just like we did before. and it's the same thing as before. There's chat covering my saved database in the console, but it's there. Will server actions params be unified in the future? Action prop versus use form state. The action prop, I don't totally follow, but the action prop is not going away. Use form state is being refined in the future to have a slightly different name to make it a little bit easier between use form state and use form status, but it's not necessary to know right now. Other questions. I'm going to switch over to the YouTube questions. I think I left off up here. How can I render a list of server components and make them render in order from top to bottom as the user scrolls down? So the rendering order would just be how your JSX is displayed. In terms of scrolling down, I think you might be asking for like a infinite scroll type behavior, which I can show something here. We're going to pop over to this really quick. I don't have it. Admin dash. This is completely unrelated, but I have this admin dash template where you can have a list of users. You can go to the next page and they're offset. So this is like the cursor in my database. So now I have the next 20, and then I get the next 20, and I get the next 20 or whatever. And you can still search like the full database as well in here too. In this template, I did build a version where you could infinite scroll this list versus doing pagination. And, you know, I think both are fine. I left the code in the template just so you can see like what this looks like. The key thing is intersection observers, basically. So you have a reference to some element on your page. And when you get to that point in the page and it's observed by the intersection observer, you can do something. And in that case, doing something was this function on intersect that I'm calling. And on intersect could be hooked up to this. Was going back to what I said earlier in the server actions being like the advanced use case. You can have server actions return JSX, which is a really convenient way of doing infinite scroll. And this is one pattern to do that. So yeah, just so you know, the more you know, the more you know. I get this message in Next.js when I try to set Open Graph image metadata based property in metadata. Export is not set for resolving social, Open Graph, or Twitter images. Yeah, I think the question here is like in my root layout, what is the point of metadata base? So this is going to be like HTTP, yeah, or whatever is. The reason for metadata base is so you can use relative paths in other parts of defining your metadata. So somewhere else where I want to do like somewhere else where I want to do this, instead of doing the full path, I can do a relative path. Ooh, not like that. So that's the reason for that. Other questions? I'm doing a project. Is it good to use other UIs such as Next UI or Chakra UI? In general, across all UI libraries, I would recommend using those that are already or moving towards runtime less CSS and JS solutions, or they're using Tailwind or using something else that doesn't have runtime JS necessary for the styles. So like Shocker, for example, is moving to Panda CSS, which uses a zero runtime CSS and JS library. I'm personally a fan of Tailwind, so I usually use things that bet on Tailwind. The demo I was just showing here, this whole thing is built with ShadCN UI, which has some pretty nifty templates you can get started with. It also has this cool thing called blocks, which I really like. It has this thing called lift mode, which I think is awesome. So if you do lift mode, you get to like pick the components that you want, which I think is cool. So this whole library is designed to be able to be copy pasted. So I go in here, I copy paste. Maybe I want this orders table. I can just copy the code, which is awesome. Look at that. And then if I want, I know I can now run in my command line like npx shadcn install badge card table, and I've got all the code in my application that I need to build this. Or maybe I want to open this up in v0 and fork this and do something for here. So maybe I want to say like, I don't know. What do I want to say? Give me your best v0 generation ideas, and we can see what we want to generate and see how good it goes. I'll come back to that. Might be off topic. Is it possible to render the root error component manually? You could trigger something that makes the error boundary show. Will the Pages router, I'm over here. Will the Pages router be getting new features? Yeah. All the work that we're doing for Turbo Pack, so Next.dev -- Turbo, which is in release candidate, which means that it's almost here, 99.8, 12 tests left. Everything I've been doing today, by the way, has been Turbo Pack, Next.dev Turbo. It's really close. This works for the Pages and App Router, so both are supported. May I ask what prettier config I'm using? I just use single quote 120 max width spaces. Best way to secure an API route, do your authentication in there or move it to your data access later. Why do we need API routes then? You don't really. I think the main case when you would want to use a route handler now is if you're trying to listen from an external source. So like you want to listen from a Stripe webhook or from some other webhook, and you need to expose that API you can put that URL in an application somewhere. In that case, then yes, it can be a very good choice for that. What about server only? So that's a good question. Let me go to here. You might have seen use server because we talked about it. There's also import server only. What the hell is this thing? Well, server only is a separate package. There's also a client only, and these server only. These packages are generally useful for the whole React ecosystem. So it's not a Next.js specific thing. This server only package was published by the React team. There's also the client only one, like I mentioned. Wow, that already has a lot of downloads. That's impressive. What this does is it guarantees that this code will only ever run on the server. So if you try to import or use any of the code in this file in a client context, it will fail. You've essentially, the term that they use is poisoned. You've poisoned this to say you can never be on the client. If you do, blow up my application because that's definitely not what I wanted to do. So that is what that is for, just so you know. Let's see. How can I revalidate a dynamic part of a partial pre-rendered page? Oh man, John, you're living in 2025 here. We haven't even talked about partial pre-rendering yet. Partial pre-rendering is still experimental, so I wouldn't recommend digging in there too far yet. It's still experimental, but we're cooking some good stuff there. Is there a function for parsing page paths in the app router? Yeah, I think what you're looking for, if you're looking to read, it looks like you're looking to read the params, because locale is one of the params, and then slug is one of the params. So yeah, use params is what you'd want there. What would be the best way to have a test dashboard be static, even when the test ID changes, since the data is being fetched on the client side? You can generate static. So for a given dynamic route, whether it is for a given dynamic parameter like slug, blog/slug/page, you can use generate static params to pre-generate whatever number of pages you want. Maybe that's like your top 50 pages. Maybe that's all of your pages. That is how you do that. Are there any plans to have route level middleware? You can do this today. It's just not as ergonomic, I think, as what people want. Like it's basically if else checks, or you can use the matchers function in middleware. We do think there's a world where we introduce more of a literal route middleware feature potentially that is different from the edge middleware type functionality that we have right now, which is like you want to run headers or rewrites or redirects programmatically in front of your application. I meant server function arguments. Oh no, I don't think those will be unified. Let's say you had a client-side input. How do you integrate the value from autocomplete with the server action? In that case, I would probably do something like this. This is not a cursed pattern. This still works. On submit, you can do something like this. On the E inside of here, on the event, read some data from the event, or if there's no other way to get the React auto search component, if this value isn't actually exposed on the form attributes, if I can't pass in name equals search and it won't get picked up on the event, and I have to do a on change, what you can do is on change this, save the values back to set search, save the value back to set search. So then you've got this React state, and then inside of here, save the DB, still a server action, you can pass in search. So this still works. Now you still don't have to set up a separate API route. You can still use event handlers. You can still call React Auto Search component or whatever the heck you want here. And you can forward information to it. So that's kind of cool. Is the ShadCN website built on Next? Yes, it is. What's up, Nikki? Thanks for joining. V0 add a filter by button under the title section to get a list of available filter options. Nice. If I have to stream media from an S3 bucket, can that be handled within a server action? I am not sure. I haven't tried that myself, because I don't know if you need to set specific headers on the response. I'm going to say yes, but I would need to test. Is this valid? Name equals programs.index.title. Sure. Yeah. Will Next.js ever have a SPA mode? we actually already do have a SPA mode. It's called a static export. Static exports are kind of the single page app mode where you can take your HTML, JavaScript, CSS files and deploy them wherever you want. No server running. It's actually more granular than a SPA mode because you can pre-generate, you can pre-render multiple routes. So maybe I want to, when I run, generate static params or get static props, or sorry, get static paths, generate static params or get static paths. When I run these functions, I can have multiple different entry points into my application that all get statically pre-generated and exported into a dump of HTML, JavaScript, CSS files that I can deploy on a server somewhere. So this is how you can build a client. It's not even, I wouldn't even call it client-only application because you can still everything's still pre-rendered in this static export world, which means that it can be the difference between looking at a blank screen with a loading spinner versus pre-rendering like the majority of the shell of the page, and then doing the data fetching on the client side. Even if the shell that you're ejecting is a React component with some styling, that it just looks a little bit cleaner than I can't pre-render anything for this given route. I can render unique shells for each route. I'm not sure about that. This shouldn't be necessary. You shouldn't need to set a custom status code here. It should still work with streaming with the app router. I've been using Amplify Gen 2. It uses Next.js. It comes with a GraphQL client of their own. I'm currently using the backend via mutations. Nice. Other questions. Where can I find this demo project? The one that I've been showing here was this one. But then the other one, admin dashboard template. The other one is here. Is there any way to get the URL with proxy? I think what you're saying is like doing a URL proxy, and the answer for that is, actually, let me get rid of all this. The answer for that is in Next config. You can do, just like you can do rewrites, you can do redirects, and redirects are URL proxies. I wish we had a more defined pattern though for server actions. Yeah, I mean, I hear you. They're still new, so a lot of these things are still being figured out. If there are things you would like to see us add to the docs, let me know. Is it possible to pass props from a client component to a server component? From a client component to a server component? No. So your like in this instance, if this is a client component, the children of it are server components. And you can do this weaving, but you're not passing props from, like, these are children. They're not, they're not ancestors. They're not passing props directly to it. I'm going to move that back. Get context search params, path names in a non-page server component. Yeah, I don't know, Nate, when you joined, I already walked through kind of why this is the way it is and then what you can do with parallel routes to still access it. It's still a page component. It's not a non-page component. Maybe we'll change this in the future. I think it's possible, but it's intentionally designed that way. Is there an easy way to share context between server components? Yes. So you can think of the React cache as server-side context, basically. So I don't know. Let me just copy this. Let's go here, maybe, or maybe in here. You could imagine a world where, I don't know, maybe this isn't even asynchronous. I mean, at this point, if it's not asynchronous, then really what you're looking for is a variable in module scope. But probably what you want is something that's asynchronous. So you're going in here and you're fetching something, await something. And now I can call this once and reuse the value across many different server components. That's probably what you're looking for. Can I do a long video explaining how to test production-ready Next.js applications with real-world examples? Let's say I'm using two server components. If I only change the URL, does the other component re-render? It depends. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but one of the things with the app router that's intentional is that when I'm clicking in between different routes, I can have some state that doesn't re-render between navigations. Even though my URLs are changing, this state persists. So it's not as black and white as the URL. But in terms of testing, I'll give another shout out to our testing docs on Vitesse, Jest, Playwright, and Cypress. Other questions? From server action, is it good practice to use import is redirect error? Oh, no. No. Definitely don't import things from next/dist. If you are doing that, please let me know and we'll figure out if there's a better solution that we can use. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but just to reiterate it here, like, you don't overly add try catch for all errors unless you're explicitly expecting that you're like, unless that is the plan of what you're trying to do and you have a path to show an error state for that case. Because what you might be wanting to do if there's an error state in that case is use form state and show something differently. The is redirect error, like, generally when you call a redirect, you're expecting the flow of the application to stop there, and that function is done. There is a discussion. I'm pretty sure this is the right one. Yeah. Unstable rethrow RFC. Make it easier for developers to write error-safe code that utilizes try-catch blocks. So this is not found redirect, permanent redirect. I'll throw this one in the chat. I'll do it in both chats. Look at that. Double chat. And let me know if that's helpful. Upcoming articles on things to do or avoid to lower billing. Yeah, in case you missed it, we released new infrastructure pricing that decreases the price of bandwidth and functions. And as part of this, we have a whole new docs page on pricing and optimizing usage for different metrics. If there's specific things that you want to hear me go into, let me know. As the React cache on the server side, yes, it's an HTTP cache. It's not an in-memory cache. If you use the Next.js cache, that can be persisted across navigations and even deployments on Vercel. When you're self-hosted, you can hook into this cache and you can, there's an adapter for a Redis cache if you want, or you can put it into durable storage if you wanted to. And on Vercel, it's going to be a Redis-like cache as well too. Is it safe to put auth logic in the layout? I would put the auth logic close to your data access layer. So in your data access layer, which if you check out the auth docs, we talk a little bit about this. You want to put your authorization and authentication calls close to whatever the function is. And those can be higher order functions. You can, however you want to decorate that function, you can do it. But yeah, put it there for sure. How long is the Webpack config that Next.js uses for production? Imagine you built a framework on top of Webpack for 6 years or however many years before we started to invest in TurboPack. There's a lot of Webpack magic because setting Webpack up from scratch is not necessarily that fun. I think Veet has done a good job here of helping bring the ecosystem forward. And a lot of that bundler configuration pain was really at the framework level. So the Webpack configuration in Next.js, it's quite a lot for sure. But we're abstracting that away so that you don't have to deal with that. Use params does not take any parameters. It's not helping me with parse function. I want to generate a URL outside of Next. I'm not totally following what you're wanting to do. But the combination of use params, well, I guess you want to get it outside of Next. I mean, you could just read the file names in the directories. Is there any way to cancel a server action? There is not. Which, if you think about it, maybe the React team will change that in the future, but most of the time when you're doing a mutation, you expect that mutation to complete unless you abort the request. So, yeah. I'm glad I don't need to configure Webpack. I agree. Server actions, I sometimes have a timeout error. Is there a max timeout for a server action, and how can I increase it? Yes, if you go to max duration, when you're deploying to Vercel, you can set a max duration to whatever makes sense for your plan. So the default is 15 seconds on Pro, but it goes up to 5 minutes. So you could put this to 60 seconds or something if you wanted to. It doesn't really make as much sense in a self-hosted context. Hey, I'm glad this is a helpful Q&A. Thanks for hanging out. To clarify, the status code has a different meaning. We specifically need 410 some pages. No, it is not supported, and it's not planned to be supported due to streaming. Let me pull up the docs here. So, for example, like redirects, which can be called deeper down in the tree of your application, they'll serve a 303. Otherwise, they'll serve a 307. So we're kind of baking in the best practices for status codes into these functions themselves. If you need a 308, then you use permanent redirect instead. And there's other instances like this where the architecture of the app router to support streaming has to enable these constraints where, like, if you trying to think of the best way to show this. If I just to go back, the question was around. I want to find the initial question. Yeah, custom status code. I don't remember what a 410 is. What's a 410? It's an error. Uh, 410 gone. The client error response indicates that the resource is no longer there. I mean, if it's no longer there, it sounds like this is more of something that you would probably want to use a 404 for. I don't know. I'm not an SEO expert. Anyways, going back to the streaming thing, this also comes up in the context of cookies. So if you imagine like you produce the initial shell of your page, and on the response, you want to add some cookie, I don't know, theme mode. So you want to set a cookie on the response for the theme mode. This gets tricky with streaming because you need to be able to, when you actually want to set this cookie, what happens if somewhere in here I have some data fetching? So let me just go like somewhere, some time has passed and I have some data fetching and then it resolves. And then inside of here, I have some server component. And inside of here, I was expecting inside of the component to be able to do like set cookie or cookies.set. The problem is, where am I setting the cookie? Like we produced a response here and then we streamed in additional content. And now I'm trying to set a cookie on the response later. It just gets weird, which is why you can only set cookies from server actions or route handlers or middleware. So it's either a mutation or the initial response that you're producing. So either the first response I'm producing, I set a cookie, or I do some mutation and that calls one of these functions that sets the cookie. Ryan from Build UI has a good video on this on YouTube. If you search for Next.js cookies, Ryan, Build UI. Shout out to Ryan. Will this video be available after the stream? Yeah, the VODs are always available on demand on Twitch and YouTube, so you can always watch them later. Thinking about AI generation stuff, I'd like to cancel a generation. That's a good question. That one I am not sure about. I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to ask our team. Other questions? What is my opinion on the Twitter drama surrounding the Next.js rendering speed? This one was funny to me. I have thoughts. I think the first thing is I think benchmarks are a good thing, especially when they're open source and easily reproducible. And I don't think micro benchmarks are inherently a bad thing either, because they can still find ways to allow you to optimize your application. My problem with the discourse is that it's missing the reality of every Next.js application, which is like you're going to have some I/O. You're going to fetch some data from somewhere, probably. And if you are, that's the majority of the time of what it takes to produce a response for the page. Whether that's 200 milliseconds or 300 milliseconds or 400 milliseconds. I mean, hopefully you can keep it as low as possible, but sometimes it takes longer than that. That's really where the rendering speed comes from. In terms of like getting much lower on how fast it can render smaller bits, there's definitely little things that we can do to optimize here. We actually, it nerd sniped some of the team members into optimizing some of the bits a little bit. And that's great. I love that. I think that's awesome. But that doesn't mean that all apps are somehow slow because of that one benchmark, that one micro benchmark. So devs like to get worked up about stuff like that. But in reality, it doesn't matter. What steps are required to migrate app with Vite and React Router to Next.js? I have good news for you because we have, if I can find my tab, we have like 4 different guides. One, how to move your application from Vite, if you're doing a Vite React app. Another one from Create React app. And then another one, if you're already on Next.js, you're using the pages router and you want to understand how to incrementally migrate over as well too. So I will drop one of these in the chat as well. Next.js 14 and RFC aren't the same thing. However, Next is the only thing that uses RFC. So how best for us mere mortals to understand what is the RFC generic version versus the Next version? I haven't went back to here, but I recently tweeted a bunch of different projects in the ecosystem that are doing really interesting stuff with React Server components. So there is a number of different frameworks building with it. There's some more experimental projects that are just kind of hacking around with all of the different pieces to just try to see, how you put the APIs together and what their own take on what an API might be, because it might be different than what Next.js does, for example. And then people have been writing some really good posts here. Tanner's doing some stuff here with TanStack. Devin's doing some stuff with Parcel. The Remix team is doing some stuff here as well too. Storybook is doing some stuff here. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff happening here. I will copy this and, oh wait, where am I at? Drop that tweet in here as well too. Let's say I want to create a product and each product has a category input to choose a category. How would you go about fetching the categories when the user finishes typing client side? This isn't exactly one-to-one what you're asking for, but it's close enough that I want to mention. Check out demo.vercel.store for in my opinion, good example of building an e-commerce store with Next.js, using the app router, using, all the latest features. It should be on a basically new version. I think it's on 14.1. You can search for shoes. It persists this to URL state. You can do filtering, also persist the URL state. All of the options here, like the sizes or the image that you're looking at, this is all persisted in URL state. I add it to my cart. My cart pops up here. This cart uses the cookies function to save this to cookies. I can proceed to my checkout. It's just a nice, it's a nice little example of showing e-commerce. And it's open source, and you can get started with it. How does Next.js streaming only work while you are on Twitch or YouTube? If you're talking about my streaming, I stream to Twitch, but I'm now starting to stream to Twitch, YouTube, and the X platform at the same time. So we'll see how it goes. Hey, hope you're doing well. I use the Next.js pages. I find the app router a bit overwhelming. Any advice is helpful. Yeah, let me know which part you find overwhelming, and hopefully I can try to talk you through how it works. Let's see, on the Twitch side, is serving redirects from a server action okay? Yes, it is okay. The use form state hook will give a type error because it's expecting a result to be returned and not a server redirect. You can probably change the response typing of the use form status, potentially. When I render 50 links, dynamic pages, 50 requests are sent to the browser. Is it okay to use preload false? Yeah. If you're rendering a page that has just a ton of links and you don't want to preload them all, you only want to preload the most important ones, you can just either make a wrapper component that wraps next link and preload the false and then opt in to preload when you need it, or you can just apply it to all of them as well too. How to trigger my suspense every time a promise is executed because search params change, for example. Suspense is only working for the first time, but not if I change with search params the search feature with user input. So The easy solution here is to put a key on your suspense. So it's keyed based on whatever the value that's changing is. However, it's kind of an anti-pattern. I mean, it works, it's fine, but in reality, what you probably want is use optimistic. So check out use optimistic. Will this, oh, I already answered that. Let's see. I know you can incrementally adopt the app router, but I'm curious if there are any performance issues related to having two types of routers running. No, I don't think there's an issue with having two different routers. It's like two different code paths, basically. The only performance gotcha there is that you can't do prefetching out of the box across routers. It's like two different worlds. So in a Next.js app router app or a Pages router app, you use the Next link component, it's going to automatically do prefetching for other routes that are, that are going to be in your viewport. It doesn't do that across Pages and app router because they're two completely separate worlds. You can still manually just put a preload tag on the page, a link, but that's one caveat of that. Recently started a Next.js app router project that's heavy and requires, or real-time heavy and requires WebSockets. I'm using Supabase real-time for a ton of data. Pusher, but limits are too low. What are my recommendations for WebSockets without a separate node backend? Check out LiveBlocks. LiveBlocks is a cool tool. Replicache is another one that's doing some cool stuff for real time. What's the best way to self-host Next.js? I'm not a fan of Docker, and I want to make the most of route handlers. I would say either use Docker or Node.js. That's kind of the blessed path for self-hosting Next.js on your own infrastructure, whether that's a VPS, whether that's EC2, whether that's Fargate, wherever you want to host it. Google Cloud Run. I actually really like Google Cloud Run. I think it is really well done, and it's a pretty easy way to host Next.js as well too. So worth checking out. Yeah. All I will say on OpenNext is that the name itself is contradictory because Next.js is open source. What they are trying to do, I have a problem with the name in the first place. What they are trying to do is provide an open source version of Vercel, which is fine and fair, but it is strange to me that they're trying to call it Next versus Vercel. Rant over, but that's just my opinion. How about WebAssembly? Can you do WebAssembly in Next.js? I think this is more like an infrastructure question, but you can do WebAssembly on Vercel, but let me know. Other questions. What are the cool features that are still experimental? I didn't really talk about partial pre-rendering yet, but this is experimental. It is still got some cooking to do, but it's getting there slowly but surely. It uses the experimental channel of React as well too. So probably don't put this into production, but what's happening here is the majority of this page is static. And then with my suspense boundaries, I get to define which parts I want to be dynamic. So today, if I'm using dynamic code like cookies or headers or search params, my page is dynamic, the whole page is dynamic. But we're trying to make this more granular with partial pre-rendering where this part and this part, they're able to stream in after I send the initial static version, which, by the way, I said don't put it into production, but I am using it on my site because I live life on the edge, but probably not for everybody. I'm only doing this because I'm dog fooding it. When you go to my blogs, the majority of the page is static except for just the view counter. And just the view counter is the dynamic part. Can we integrate Vite for dev by ourselves? Dev server is slow. You should check out TurboPack. Next dev -- turbo, and then with 14.2 should be considerably faster. it would be an incredible amount of work to support multiple bundlers inside of Next.js. It's been a multi-year journey to work on TurboPack, and 6+ years for Webpack. So Vite's great, the ecosystem's great. It's just not feasible for us to support both. Is there any way to pass runtime envers to global error? No, I don't believe so. Because it is a client component. And I think well, I don't know what you mean by runtime envers. Because it's a client component, you can't do process.env super secret env. You could still fetch data on the client. So I think somewhere in here, oh, maybe not. You could still do like SWR, fetch some runtime data, and then use that to report back to Sentry. So it's still possible. It's just not, you're not doing data fetching on the server side. You're data fetching in a client component. Questions. What is the best way to use async fetching client components? So this isn't ready yet. The ideal vision for where React wants to take this, that is my understanding, but I don't think it's ready yet, is that you would be able to mark a client component as async. So you would be able to use that same programming model even in a client-only application, but it's not ready yet. I think that's where they want to go, but I'd have to double check. Is it possible to get the client's IP address in the pages router or app router? Yeah, you can read it through the headers function. What's your opinion on using Next for front-end e-commerce projects that are using Python or Django? That's fine. If you already have an existing backend somewhere, whether it's Python or Java or C, C#, C++, COBOL, I'm trying to think of the most random languages I can think of, Fortran, that's fine. You can use whatever you would like. It's more of a function of how your team works, I would say. Oh, I missed Go. Yeah, any opinion on using app router with Golang? I think it's fine. I mean, if you like Go or Rust or Zig or I don't know, any more of these like lower level languages and you want to use them as your backend and call into them from Next.js, I think that's fine. I think the most productive you can be in a Next.js app is when you're building it full stack in there, but that doesn't work for every team, and it wasn't designed to be that way, right? Because a lot of teams have an existing API that they're using across web and mobile. They want to be able to make calls to that API in their data access layer, and that's fine as well too. I'm building a dashboard in Next. I've got a value ID that is needed app-wide. So I put it in context. The thing is, some pages require that value as a search param when making a call to an external API. Since I'm storing in context, it's in a client component. Yep. So in this instance, you probably want the React cache. I guess it depends if your ID value is dynamic. Like, do you need to go fetch it from a dynamic location, or is it static? If it is a static ID, you can put it in module scope and you can use it in any server component, any server file, and you can just read it and it's fine. If it is requiring a promise to call some information, call some API to get something back, then if you use React Cache, it's like context on the server side. So then you can call it and use it just like you would call it if you were using a client component. I'm having a hard time moving data loading out of my layout without being forced to client-side data loading. It seems to block rendering if it's in layout, but I can't easily move my sidebar, for example, without making multiple wrappers that eventually lead to a client component. I, I really would have to see an example because I'm wondering why you feel like you're forced to use client-side data loading. That part I'm curious on. Um, and then in terms of multiple wrappers, maybe parallel routing is what you're looking for that we talked about a little bit earlier. Let me know if you were here for that. If I have to add route handlers, how do I do multiple HTTP nouns for a single endpoint? You define them in the same file. So technically this is a valid route handler. You could have every single HTTP verb in one file. What camera am I using? I have a Sony A7 III. Would it be possible to open an SSE server-side events connection on the server and stream page content that would be rendered on the client? You can use server-side events in Next. I don't know if I have an example, but it should be doable. Yeah, should be doable. Can you opt out of nested layouts? Oh gosh, I never talked about this one, did I? I have a sidebar and I want to opt out. Okay, where were we at here? We talked about this. We talked about this. Let's talk about opting out and route groups. So let's say, well, there's one, I'm going to need to get rid of that redirect. Let's say that I want to have a what's a good example of this? Because right now, like, there isn't a lot going on in this route layout where I necessarily like need to opt out of this. But let's say I want to do a route group called app and a route group called marketing. And I'm going to take everything in slash or the dynamic route of team into app. And then inside of marketing, we're going to do page.tsx, export default function page, return. We're going to do section and welcome to my site. And this is going to be class name, background green. So we've got our marketing page that's inside of our marketing route group. Then we've got the app that's our dashboard inside of here. And maybe we even do let's go to dashboard. And this is going to go to Lee Rob. I'll restart my dev server. We'll go back over to here. You can think about route groups as just ways to organize your code, basically. So slash marketing, I only want it to be the stuff that relates to the marketing pages of my website. Slash app, I want it to be everything that has to do with dynamic routes in this like dashboard application of my website. And maybe inside of here, maybe we want to take this section I feel like the parent is probably so Is it the body? Where is my body? Root layout, body. Height full. I feel like this is always the freaking bane of my existence. Wait, is that right? Is that the... I swore it was like a height, 100 view height. Maybe not, because it doesn't seem like it's picking that up. Chat, what am I doing? Height screen. Ah, damn it. Ah, yes. Tailwind. What are we doing? There we go. Okay, just to make a green background. All I wanted to show was, let's say in this route group, I want to do things completely differently. And I want to have a bunch of different pages in here. So I can have a layout, export, default function. I can do this, except this is the marketing layout. And I keep that section. I render some children. And then this part is going to be the dynamic bit. I do this. Okay, so now if I go back to here, I still want to keep this. I can get rid of this. I'm going to need a fragment though. So that still works. But now I could go to / features or something. And page.tsx and features. Now the tricky thing here is that this /features. Oh yeah, well Next.js is smarter than I thought. I was like, man, am I going to need to tell it that this route is already taken? Because if I go to /features, that's going to someone on the logged in experience. But it knows, because I've defined this route, that /features is a marketing page route that has a completely different layout and page structure, and it's all built within the same app. That's route groups. Can I add 3 post endpoints in a single file? No. You need to do separate route handlers for separate post endpoints. I'm glad everyone else knew it was height screen. My Tailwind skills are getting rusty, I guess. Oh yeah, or dynamic view height. When are browsers, oh man. I wish it was easier to do that. Happens to the best of us. Yes, it does. Let's see. Any plans for scaffolding tools in Next a la Rails? Yes, we do have plans to make the experience of creating your first application easier. I don't know if it will be built into, it probably won't be built into Create Next app. We kind of want to keep that minimal, but we are just generally at Vercel thinking about ways to make scaffolding out a Next app easier. I'll give a quick plug to this tool, Kiramase, which does just that, from Nico on our team. Pretty cool tool. I can't revalidate fetch to an API route if the routes are calling Prisma functions. So my guess here, I would recommend first off using a server action, because that's going to eliminate a category of confusion on like invalidating the cache. What is probably happening here is that you're doing a call to Prisma, but your route handler is not running dynamically, or you're not using revalidate tag or revalidate path to revalidate the entirety of that content. Let me know. Yes, it will be available on YouTube and Twitch. Did I build the block bootstrap template? No. Give away my laptop. Nah, I like it. I'm keeping it. Yes, this is true. See you in the next stream. Yeah, thanks for hanging out at 3 a.m. You're a champ. Are parallel routes to create server components without using the server directive, but adding in the layout loading? So the server directive is only needed for server actions. You don't need to use a server directive for just using a general server component. Like you don't have to annotate every server component file with use server. You can think of use server as automatically scaffolding out that API endpoint for you like a tRPC. How can I revalidate tag for a dynamic route? I think we have an example of this here. Oh wait, no. Sorry. Revalidate path. The way you do it for a dynamic route is like this. So blog/slug and then the page. Or if there's a route group, you can do that as well too. Are the pages cached by default in Next.js? Yes, they are. I was trying to use both revalidate and revalidate tag. Revalidate path uses revalidate tag under the hood. So you won't need to use both. I'm happy to look at an example of your code if you want to share an example. For authentication in Next.js, anything in our docs is great. There's a bunch of different solutions. I usually use when I say roll my own, I mean I'm not using a managed service. So for most of or a hosted service, because for most of the stuff I'm doing, it's just not necessary. But I think both roll your own or managed services are fine depending on what you're trying to build. Assume I have 2 servers. In the pages router, the next server is only hit at the beginning in the pages router, the server is only hit at the beginning of the page load. And then navigations between pages only hit the API server. Can I get the same behavior with the app router? I thought using use client on each page was the same thing. Use client is a way for you to use interactivity in your application, like client-side hooks like useState or useEffect. Your pages are still pre-rendered on the server. So if I navigate between page A and page B is using a client component, I'm still going to see the initial HTML that then gets hydrated, just like if it was a server-rendered application. In terms of navigations only hitting the API server, it depends. Like anything you can do in the pages router, you can do in the app router and more. So yes, but I think what you're really asking is like, do I want the entire page to be static or do I want the entire page to be dynamic? Is the app router going to have type safety? Ideally for everything that includes paths like revalid dates, links, and so on. Revalidating a path somewhere else in your page is hard to maintain long-term without maps. Yeah, I like this idea. We've talked about what a solution could look like here. We do have this experimental flag for typed routes when you're doing this on like a link component, which I think is nice. But I would like to do more with that in the future. So definitely possible. Do cron jobs work in Next.js? Is a feature stable? Cron jobs aren't a feature of Next.js, but we do have cron jobs on Vercel, and they are stable and they can work with Next.js. Vercel does take internships. If we have them, they'll be up on our website. Nice hat, thank you. Am I going to when and if are you going to revert back to fetch changes? So we already have one option. If you don't want to opt out of caching on a fetch with the no store argument, you can already use the no store function today, which is semantically similar to if you imagine like using the cookies or headers functions where you're reading some value from the incoming request. Then in the most recent release, 14.2, we added the ability to configure stale times for the client router cache. That's the next step here, but we're not done. There's still a lot more that we want to do to improve the ergonomics around caching, the APIs, figure out how to get some of these unstable APIs either to stable or to have a better solution. So we'll definitely be talking about more caching things in the next 3 to 6 months. So definitely expect to hear more about that. Is there a Next.js flavored dev tools? Yes, we are working on making some dev tools. I think the biggest things that I've found so far that would be very helpful is visualizing and understanding the server and client boundaries, like the tree. And then also partial pre-rendering. We've started to build some solutions internally just as we're working around it as well too. There's more there. I think the console logging has got a lot better, and we want to take this even further. There's a new option in here called logging, and I think it's like full fetches or something. Logging fetches full URL true. So just to show an example of what that looks like. So there's no data fetch on this page. There's no data fetch on that page. I go here. There are now data fetches. So I see a Git API users GitHub cache hit. I go to Roush G. That is a cache hit. I go to shadcn. That's a cache miss. So it was not there. Now I reload the page. It is here. Nice. If I clear this, Command K, I reload a bunch. They're all cache hits. It's reading from the cache. If I Command Shift R, I clear the cache, and now I see cache skip. So that's already helped quite a bit for understanding what's cached, what's not cached. So I'd recommend checking that out. Yeah, I definitely want to make the dev tools handle cache reporting a bit better. Part of the reason why we currently, at least today, change fetch, why fetch is deduped, is going back to, I don't have the code anymore. But if you're wanting to do, let me pull up an example. If you want to do like generate metadata and you're calling your database here, but then you're also using it inside of the page, then this is where having fetch cached is really helpful because you don't have to manually opt into it. But we've heard feedback that not everybody likes that. So that's why we're working on exploring what other options we have here. Still working on partial pre-rendering. Handling auth close to the data is the best practice. Yes. The most common way of doing it is with the middleware. I think most things that use middleware today are using middleware to keep the session alive. So I would still recommend doing auth close to your data. Is Next.js caching and refreshing similar to Redis? Yes, insofar as you can use, if you're self-hosting a Next.js app, you can use a Redis adapter to store to durably store your cache responses. Either that is the normal Redis that is not durable, or a durable Redis store, meaning like actual storage, like Upstash. On Vercel, that's also kind of taken care of for you. If you deploy, you get to use effectively a Redis cache, a more granular cache. I think the main difference from Redis is that using Redis directly is that it's giving you a more streamlined, a more slim API that's only for Next.js. With Redis, you can do a whole bunch of stuff. You can do a lot with Redis. You can do queues. There's so much stuff. It's insane. Next.js is just focused on one small sliver of that. For disabling prefetch, the best thing to do is to write a component like this. Export. Well, it doesn't need to be an export. Well, maybe it does. Export function, my link, and this is going to return link. And we could take props and spread the props. And we want this to be prefetch. Basically something like that. Oh no. I don't know why it's complaining. So render a link, spread all the props so you use it just like normal link. Default to false unless you tell it that you explicitly want prefetch. Like something like that could work. Any spoilers for NextConf? Not yet. It'll probably be in October again this year. That's the plan. But no spoilers yet. I do think that something with the story around partial pre-rendering, like, and caching, we're already working on it, but we're gonna hopefully have something more substantial to show in the next 6 months there. So kind of continue working on that. Clerk in Next, yeah, Clerk's great. Am I coming to ReactConf in May? Yes, I will be at ReactConf in May. I'm giving a talk, so that should be fun. It should be recorded, I'm guessing, so that'll be fun. Yeah, NextConf was a good time. How many pages is it possible to generate for each product in an e-commerce store? I mean, this is kind of a function of how long you want your builds to be and how important the long tail of products to be generated static is for your store. Maybe you want to statically generate the top 100 pages so that you're guaranteed they always are a cache hit the first time you see them. But you want to keep faster builds. If you maybe want to have a little bit slower builds, you generate 30,000 pages, you could technically do that as well too. Server actions is like get server-side props. Not exactly. Server actions are like, they are like TRPC, or they're like API routes in some ways. Get server-side props are basically RSCs. Yeah. Like get server-side props, Next.js had to have its own way of fetching data. And now it's built into, and not just Next.js, but any of the frameworks in the ecosystem. And now it's built into React itself, or there's primitives in React itself, to where frameworks don't need to implement their own APIs for that. I have a client component that fetches data, and I cache it as no store. But if I add something to the backend, it doesn't load right away. So a client component that fetches data, cache it no store. I feel like I add something to the back end. I think what you're asking for here is there's no way of Next.js to know how to invalidate the cache when something happens that it doesn't observe. So when you're saying like add something to the backend, like if you go in and manually edit something in your database, typically in a Next app, if that's happening with a server action, you're telling the cache to get invalidated because you're calling React, or you're calling revalidate path or revalidate tag. So one way of doing this, if you are listening for changes in your backend, is to have a webhook on changes that calls revalidate tag or revalidate path when changes are made to your backend. This works pretty well, for example, when you consider a backend like a CMS. So I go to my CMS, I hit publish, data changes, I call the webhook, it invalidates my data, I update the page. Yeah. Other questions? Using TanStack query, can I use Axios? Yes. Has there been any fixes to loading in the latest minor? I've seen odd behavior with dynamic routes. Loading is just syntactic sugar over React suspense. So I don't know the exact issue that you're running into, but it's also worth trying just using suspense normally. Basically, that's all loading is doing for you, is just manually setting up a suspense boundary for you. When will Create Next app use the newest ESLint flat config files as the default? I'm not sure. Is that like widely the new way of doing it? I don't know a lot about ESLint flat config files, to be honest. A random question with unstable cache. How would you invalidate with an ID? So invalidate post at some ID. It's part of the options that you pass in. So tags, and then this could be, could be like that, user.id, and then somewhere validate tag. So you have a call to get a user by ID. You go fetch that user. You tag it based on the ID. This is the silly key parts thing that we want to make better. And then you call revalidate tag given that user ID. Where is the ID coming from? Since that ID isn't defined in scope. That's a good point. This is not valid TypeScript. This is me just throwing code at the screen here. Yeah, I don't know actually how you would do that. It's kind of weird, isn't it? It's one of the quirks of this API and why we want to move to something different, is because what we want to do is, I guess in this instance, you would just do like users, but that's less than ideal. We want to do, I don't know exactly what the API will look like, but you could imagine there's a function like this that you call rather than doing this. So more to come on that. Yeah. What is the Twitch URL? I will drop my Twitch in the chat. The difference between unstable cache and importing cache from React is unstable cache. The better way of thinking about this is like the Next cache versus the React cache. The React cache is like per request. The Next.js cache can be across multiple requests. That's the big difference. I just hit 3 hours of stream, and I think it's probably about time to wrap things up. It's a lot of talking. Raid Theo. Is Theo live? Oh boy. I gotta remember how to raid people. Oh, has it been 4 hours? Oh no, I'm echoing. Oh, it has almost been 4 hours. Holy shit. Time flies when you're having fun. Starting in a few minutes. Oh man, there's so many. I'm such a Twitch newbie. Uptime. Does that work? Hi, Rob. wait. I thought that was the auto-generated response. I think I still need to build the helper commands there. Well, I'm glad y'all have enjoyed hanging out on this Sunday. Yeah, Stream Elements. I'm glad it's been fun. I can't raid on YouTube. That would be kind of fun. Imagine raiding somebody else's live YouTube stream. But yeah, I'm glad y'all found this helpful. It'll be live on my Twitch as a replay. It will also be available to rewatch on my YouTube or on X. I guess I'm not really sure how that works on the X platform, but here we are. So I'm going to find out. That's the first stream there. All right. Let's try rating Theo, and then we'll end this out. Thanks y'all for hanging out. This was fun. Viewers are ready to raid Theo in 7, 6, 5. Good luck. Have fun. YouTube fam, it was good hanging out. See you later.